Close your eyes and let the modern world fade away. The glow of screens, the endless notifications, the curated profiles and calculated swipes, all of it dissolving like morning mist over a medieval field. Step back with me now, not just years but centuries, moving through time like walking backward through a long, dim corridor, past smartphones and computers, past television and radio, past electricity itself. Keep going, past the Industrial Revolution with its factories and railways, past the Enlightenment with its emphasis on reason and individual rights, past the printing press that democratized knowledge, past the Renaissance that celebrated human potential. Land here in the stretch of history we call the Middle Ages, that 1,000-year span from roughly 500 to 1500 AD. The world you're standing in now bears almost no resemblance to the one you left. The very air smells different. Wood smoke and horse dung and unwashed humanity mixing with the scent of fresh bread from the baker and herbs drying in cottage windows. The sounds are different too. No cars, no machines, just human voices and animal noises, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the creak of a cartwheel, church bells marking the hours. But more than the sensory differences, it's the invisible structures that have changed. The assumptions that governed life, the possibilities that existed, and the ones that didn't. In this world, the concepts you've left behind, personal choice, romantic love, individual fulfillment, these aren't just absent, they're almost incomprehensible. This is a world where who you marry has nothing to do with attraction or compatibility, where sex isn't private but regulated by elaborate church rules, where your desires, your preferences, your very sense of self take a back seat to family duty, social position, and religious obligation. Welcome to a world without dating apps. Without dating at all, really. At least not as you understand it. A world without the idea of choosing a romantic partner based on chemistry or shared interests. Without first dates or relationship milestones, or the freedom to kiss someone just because you both want to. This is medieval Europe, and nothing here works the way you expect. The very phrase hookup culture would have made no sense to a medieval person. Casual sex, the idea of physical intimacy without emotional commitment or expectation of marriage. This existed, but it had a name, sin, and more specifically, it had consequences, for women especially, ruinous ones. The modern notion of a hookup, two people meeting, finding each other attractive, sleeping together without strings attached, and then moving on with their lives. This simply wasn't possible in a world where pregnancy couldn't be reliably prevented, where a woman's virginity before marriage and fidelity within it were the foundation of her value, where reputation was everything and privacy was almost non-existent. And yet, and this is crucial, medieval people still desired each other, still found creative ways to meet, to flirt, to pursue what they wanted, still fell in love, desperately and completely, sometimes with exactly the wrong person, still had sex outside the approved bounds, in secret, risking scandal and punishment. The human drive for connection, for pleasure, for intimacy, this hasn't changed across the centuries. What changed were the obstacles in its path and the strategies for navigating them. Tonight, we're going on a long journey through this world. We'll explore how people actually found each other in a time when introductions were formal and supervised, how they communicated interest when a moment alone together was nearly impossible, how they navigated the crushing weight of church teaching that sex was shameful, even within marriage. how they dealt with pregnancies they couldn't afford, desires they weren't allowed to act on, attractions that violated every rule they'd been taught. We'll meet nobles trapped in political marriages who created an entire culture of romantic yearning for people they could never truly have. Peasants who couldn't afford legal weddings but built lives together anyway. Prostitutes working in brothels licensed and taxed by the very bishops who condemned fornication from the pulpit. Monks writing passionate poetry to other monks. Women whispering herbal recipes to each other. Knowledge of how to prevent or end pregnancies that the church said was murder. Couples meeting in fields and forests and empty churches, stealing moments of privacy in a world where privacy barely existed. The story we're telling tonight isn't simple. It can't be. The Middle Ages lasted 1,000 years and covered an entire continent. What was true in 11th century Sicily wasn't true in 14th century Scotland. What applied to nobles didn't apply to peasants. What the church taught and what people actually practiced were often wildly different things. Regional customs varied. Islamic rule in parts of Spain and southern Italy created different sexual cultures than existed in Christian Northern Europe. Economic conditions, plague, war, all these shaped how people lived and loved. But within all this complexity, patterns emerge. The extraordinary power of the church over intimate life. The economic basis of marriage across all social classes. The persistent double standards between men and women. The creative resistance of ordinary people to rules they found impossible to follow. The gap between romantic ideals in literature and messy reality in practice. These patterns tell us something important, not just about the medieval world, but about ourselves, about how recent and fragile our freedoms are. So get comfortable. Let your mind settle. As we explore this distant world together, you might find it alternately shocking, familiar, tragic, ridiculous, and deeply human. Because medieval people, for all the strangeness of their world, felt what we feel. Their hearts raced the same way. They lay awake thinking about someone's smile. They took foolish risks for moments of pleasure. They loved people they shouldn't. They broke rules they knew were dangerous to break. They were human, and that humanity speaks across the centuries in ways that might surprise you. Let's begin with the foundation of everything, marriage itself, because until you understand how radically different medieval marriage was from modern marriage, nothing else will make sense. Marriage in the modern Western world is ideally, at least, the culmination of a romantic journey. You meet someone through friends, work, an app, random chance. You're attracted to them. You spend time together, getting to know each other. You discover compatibility, or you don't. If you do, the relationship deepens. You become intimate, physically and emotionally. You meet each other's families. You talk about the future. Maybe you move in together. Eventually, if everything aligns, one person proposes, the other accepts, and you get married to celebrate and formalize the love you've built together. This entire process, this idea that marriage should be based on love and personal choice, is radically recent. For most of human history, including the entire medieval period, marriage had nothing to do with romance, nothing at all. It was an economic and political arrangement, pure and simple. A transaction as businesslike as selling grain or buying a horse. For the nobility, this was most explicitly true. A noble marriage was diplomacy, conducted through betrothals and dowries. It was how families secured alliances, made peace after wars, expanded their territorial holdings, ensured the continuation of their bloodlines. The two people being married were important only as the vehicles through which property and power transferred. Their personal feelings about each other were not just unimportant, they were actively irrelevant, even potentially problematic. Imagine you're a young woman born into a noble family in 12th century France. Your father is a count, reasonably powerful, with lands that produce enough income to live well and maintain armed knights for defense. But political winds are shifting. A more powerful duke to the north has been making territorial claims. Your father needs an ally, someone with military strength who can protect his interests. The duke has a nephew, a man in his late 20s, who needs a wife and an inheritance to establish himself. Your father and the duke begin negotiations. They don't consult you. Why would they? You're 13 years old. You've been raised to understand that your duty is to marry well for your family's benefit. The negotiations focus on practical matters. What lands will you bring as your dowry? What properties will your husband settle on you? The dower that will support you if he dies first. How many children will you be expected to produce? What happens if you're barren? All of this is written into a formal contract before you ever meet your future husband. When you finally do meet him, perhaps a week before the wedding, you spend time together in a hall full of witnesses, your family's all around you, watching to ensure propriety. He's not unkind, he's not cruel, but there's no spark, no connection. He's a stranger who will soon have complete legal authority over you and your body. In a few days, you'll stand before a priest and make vows binding yourself to him for life. Then you'll go to his bed, where he'll take your virginity, probably without much concern for your comfort or pleasure, because the wedding night is about establishing the marriage legally through consummation, not about mutual enjoyment. This was normal. This was expected. No one thought it was tragic or unusual. A good marriage among the nobility was one that served both families' interests. If affection developed over time, that was a pleasant bonus. If it didn't, you managed. You maintained appearances. You did your duty. You produced heirs. And if you were very lucky and very discreet, you might find actual affection outside your marriage, though that came with its own complications. The young age of marriage, especially for girls, wasn't universal, but it was common enough. The church technically required girls to be at least 12 and boys 14 before marriage, the age of puberty in church law. But betrothals could happen much earlier. A girl might be promised in marriage as a young child, the actual wedding delayed until after puberty. Some noble marriages involved children who were essentially symbolic participants, the marriage not consummated until years later, but the alliance sealed from childhood. These child betrothals could be broken if either party objected once they reached the age of consent, but the pressure to go through with them was enormous. Families had made plans, exchanged property, formed alliances, all based on the marriage happening. A young person who refused was letting down their entire family, potentially damaging their house's political position. Most went through with it. For boys, especially heirs, there was slightly more flexibility, but not much. An eldest son who would inherit his father's title and lands was too valuable a piece to be allowed to marry for love. His marriage would be arranged to maximize family advantage. Younger sons, who wouldn't inherit the main title, sometimes had more freedom, though they also had less value on the marriage market. Many younger sons never married at all, instead joining the church or living as permanent dependents of their elder brother. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this sounds grim for the nobility, but surely peasants who didn't have estates and titles to worry about had more freedom. And you'd be partly right. Peasant marriages were less likely to be arranged without the couple's input. Young peasants often had more opportunity to meet and get to know potential spouses. There was often real affection, even love between peasant couples who married. But peasant marriage was still primarily an economic arrangement. It was about combining two households, two sets of labor, two small inheritances of land or tools or livestock. Peasant families needed all the labor they could get. A wife brought her work to the marriage as much as any dowry. She'd cook, clean, spin thread, weave cloth, tend the garden, care for animals, help in the fields during harvest. A husband brought his labor too, ploughing, planting, repairing tools and buildings, all the heavy work that kept a farm functioning. Marriage among peasants was about survival, about pooling resources to make it through the constant threat of famine, disease, bad harvests. Love was nice if you could get it, but compatibility in work was more important. Could you work together? Could you keep the household fed? Could you produce children who would help with the work and support you in old age? These were the crucial questions. And here's something that might surprise you. Many peasants didn't formally marry at all. A church wedding cost money. Money many peasants didn't have. The priest expected fees. A wedding feast was traditional. New clothes if you could manage it. For peasants living on the edge of subsistence, these costs could be prohibitive. So they did without. Instead, couples entered into informal marriages. They might make a verbal pledge to each other in front of witnesses. They might simply begin living together as husband and wife, recognized as such by their community, even without church blessing. These informal unions were common enough that the church spent centuries trying to regulate them, insisting that proper bans be read, that marriages happen in church, that priests officiate. But in rural areas far from church authority, enforcement was spotty at best. The church did eventually win this battle, more or less. By the late medieval period, church weddings were becoming the norm even among peasants. But throughout much of the Middle Ages, informal marriage was a perfectly acceptable alternative to people who couldn't afford the formal version. One thing that united all marriages, noble and peasant, formal and informal, was this: marriage transformed a woman's legal status completely. Under medieval law, heavily influenced by both Germanic tradition and Roman law, a married woman ceased to exist as a separate legal entity. She became a feme covert, literally a covered woman, subsumed under her husband's legal identity. Her property became his. Her earnings became his. Any children born to the marriage belonged to him. She could not make contracts without his permission. She could not testify in court against him. In most jurisdictions, he had the legal right to correct her with physical punishment, as long as he didn't cause permanent injury. This wasn't theoretical. This was the actual legal structure that governed married women's lives. A husband's authority over his wife was reinforced by church teaching, which held that women were subordinate to men as part of God's natural order. St. Paul's instruction that wives should submit to their husbands was taken as divine mandate. Disobedient wives weren't just bad partners. They were violating God's plan for creation. This doesn't mean all medieval marriages were miserable, or that all husbands were tyrants. Many marriages, especially among peasants, involved genuine partnership and shared decision-making. Many husbands loved and respected their wives, but the legal and social structure ensured that ultimate authority rested with the husband, and wives who ended up with cruel or neglectful husbands had very limited recourse. Divorce was nearly impossible. The Catholic Church considered marriage a sacrament, a holy union that couldn't be dissolved except under very specific circumstances. Annulment was possible if you could prove the marriage had never been valid to begin with. Maybe one party had been forced into it. Maybe there was a prior marriage contract. Maybe the couple were too closely related. Maybe the husband was impotent and the marriage had never been consummated. But these grounds were narrow, and proving them was difficult, especially for women who lacked independent legal standing. A man who wanted out of a marriage had more options, though they weren't easy. He might be able to afford the legal fees and bribes necessary to get an annulment from an ecclesiastical court. Or he might simply abandon his wife, leaving her in legal limbo, still married but without support. A woman had far fewer options. She could flee to a convent, essentially becoming a nun to escape an unbearable marriage. She could run away and hope to avoid being found and returned, or she could endure. Given all this, given that marriage was an economic and political transaction that legally subordinated women to men and was nearly impossible to escape, you might wonder, where did love fit in? Where did desire? Where did romance, passion, all the feelings that we associate with intimate relationships? The answer is complicated. Love and marriage could coexist. Some married couples did fall in love, either before marriage or during it. But love and marriage occupied different spheres. They didn't have to overlap. Marriage was duty, obligation, the foundation of household and family. Love, romantic love, passionate love, was something separate. And sometimes, often actually, it existed outside marriage entirely. This brings us to perhaps the most important force, shaping medieval sexuality, more powerful than law, more persistent than custom, more invasive than family: the Church. The medieval Catholic Church didn't just have opinions about sex. It claimed jurisdiction over it, the right to define what was permissible and what wasn't, when and how and with whom. It created an elaborate theology of sexuality and an even more elaborate system for enforcing it. And it reached into the most intimate moments of people's lives with a presumption of authority that's hard for modern minds to fully grasp. The Church's basic position was simple to state, though its implications were vast. Sex was for one purpose: procreation within Christian marriage. That's it. That was the only fully legitimate use of human sexuality. Everything else, all of it, was sinful to one degree or another. This meant that sex before marriage, sex outside marriage, sex with someone of the same gender, sex by yourself, all of these were obviously forbidden. But it also meant that even sex within marriage, the one permitted context, came with a dizzying array of restrictions and caveats. Let's start with timing, because the Church had strong opinions about when married couples could and couldn't have sex. Sundays were out. That was the Lord's Day, meant for worship and spiritual contemplation, not earthly pleasures. But the prohibitions didn't stop there. Thursdays were forbidden in some regions, commemorating Christ's arrest. Fridays were definitely out, the day of crucifixion. Saturdays were often forbidden too, in honor of the Virgin Mary. Beyond these weekly restrictions, there were seasonal prohibitions. The 40 days of Lent before Easter, absolutely no sex. The 20 or sometimes 40 days before Christmas, same rule. The period before Pentecost, also forbidden in many dioceses. When you start tallying it all up, the prohibited days come to somewhere around 40 to 50% of the year. But wait, there's more. You were also supposed to abstain during your wife's menstrual period, considered a time of impurity. During pregnancy, though there was some debate about this, Many authorities argued that sex during pregnancy was unnecessary since conception had already occurred. During breastfeeding, which in the medieval period typically lasted 1 to 2 years, sex was discouraged. And for 40 days after childbirth, a period called churching, sex was absolutely forbidden while the woman underwent ritual purification. If you add all these restrictions together, a married couple living strictly according to church teaching might have sex less than 100 days a year. And that's if we're being generous with the counting. Now, the church didn't just regulate when married couples could have sex. It also had detailed rules about how. The only acceptable position was what we now call missionary, man on top, face to face. Any variation from this was at minimum a venial sin, possibly more serious depending on the position. Why this obsession with positioning? The Church Fathers, drawing on ancient medical theories about conception, believed that any position other than missionary interfered with proper procreation. Woman on top was particularly condemned because it inverted the natural hierarchy of male over female. Sex from behind was animalistic. Sitting, standing, any creative variation, all forbidden. Some sources mention a nightshirt with a strategic hole, sometimes called a chemise cagoule, which supposedly allowed procreation while minimizing sinful skin contact. Whether this garment actually existed or was invented later as anti-Catholic propaganda is debated. But the fact that people found it plausible tells you everything about the church's reputation regarding sexuality. The deeper issue, the thing that really drove all these restrictions, was pleasure itself. The church taught that sexual pleasure, even within marriage, even during procreative sex, was tainted by sin. This went back to Augustine of Hippo, the 4th century theologian whose views on sexuality dominated Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. Augustine argued that sexual pleasure was a consequence of original sin, a reminder of humanity's fallen nature. The pleasure itself was the problem. This created a bizarre situation. Married couples were supposed to have sex, that was their duty. How else would children be conceived? But they were supposed to do it without enjoying it, or at least while minimizing the enjoyment. The ideal was to approach marital sex with the grim determination of someone taking unpleasant medicine. Necessary, but nothing to celebrate. One theologian wrote that a man who loved his wife too passionately was committing adultery with her. Even within marriage, excessive desire, too much enthusiasm, these were spiritually dangerous. The medieval church was deeply suspicious of passion in all its forms, but sexual passion was particularly problematic. This suspicion extended to desire itself, not just the act. Feeling lust for someone, even if you never acted on it, was sinful. Looking at someone with desire, what Christ called adultery of the heart in the Gospels, required confession and penance. The mere thought was an offense against God. Now, you're probably thinking, there's no way people actually followed all these rules. And you'd be right. Most people didn't. The gap between official church teaching and actual practice was enormous, a chasm really. But that doesn't mean the teachings were irrelevant. They shaped the culture, created guilt and shame around natural desires, gave the church enormous power over people's intimate lives. The mechanism for enforcing all this was confession. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated that every Christian must confess their sins to a priest at least once a year. This gave the church a direct window into people's private lives. And to help priests navigate the confessional, the church produced texts called penitentials, essentially handbooks listing various sins and the appropriate penances for each. These penitentials are remarkable documents. They catalogue sins with an exhaustive attention to detail that's almost comical if it weren't so invasive. Specific sexual acts, positions, circumstances, all laid out with corresponding penances measured in fasts, prayers, pilgrimages. Masturbation might earn you 20 days of bread and water. Sex during menstruation, 40 days. Anal sex, years of penance. The lists went on, attempting to cover every conceivable sexual variation. Reading through these penitentials gives you a voyeuristic glimpse into what medieval priests were asking about in the confessional. Did you have sex on Sunday? What position did you use? Did you derive pleasure from it? Did you think lustful thoughts about someone other than your spouse? Did you touch yourself? These intensely personal questions were considered legitimate subjects for priestly interrogation. The penance itself varied depending on the sin's severity and the sinner's status. A priest who broke his vow of celibacy faced harsher penalties than a layperson committing the same act. Repeat offences earned escalating punishments. Public sins, ones that caused scandal, required public penance, standing outside the church in penitential garments while your neighbours filed past knowing exactly what you'd done. But here's the thing about the confessional system. It was also a mechanism for managing the gap between ideal and reality. You could sin, confess, do your penance, and be reconciled to the church. It wasn't a free pass. Penance could be quite harsh, but it was a way of handling the fact that humans consistently failed to meet impossible standards. The system acknowledged that people would sin sexually, provided a path back to grace, and in the process, maintained the church's authority as the necessary intermediary between sinners and salvation. This power was extraordinary. Imagine living in a world where your priest knows your most intimate secrets, where you've confessed desires and acts you'd never tell another soul, where that knowledge gives him leverage over you. The potential for abuse was obvious, and it sometimes manifested. Confessors who demanded sexual favors from female penitents, priests who used confessional knowledge to blackmail or manipulate. These abuses happened often enough that church authorities issued warnings against them. For women especially, the confessional could be fraught. You were expected to confess your sexual sins in detail, but doing so to a male authority figure who held power over your spiritual fate created a dynamic ripe for exploitation. Some women refused to confess sexual matters, risking their souls rather than share such intimate information. Others found sympathetic confessors, priests who were more concerned with offering guidance than interrogating every detail. The church's obsession with sexual sin wasn't uniform across the medieval period. Early medieval attitudes were somewhat more relaxed, at least among the laity. But during the High Middle Ages, particularly from the 11th century onward, there was an intensification of concern about sexual purity. This coincided with church reform movements that emphasized clerical celibacy and tried to separate the clergy more sharply from the laity. Clerical celibacy itself was a contentious issue throughout the medieval period. The requirement that priests not marry was established early in church history, but it was widely ignored for centuries. Many priests had wives or concubines openly. Their children, while technically illegitimate, often followed their fathers into church careers. The reform movement of the 11th and 12th centuries tried to enforce clerical celibacy more rigorously. Priests were forbidden from marrying. Those with wives were ordered to send them away. Concubinage was condemned. The logic was partly theological. Priests needed to be pure to handle the sacred mysteries, but it was also practical. Married priests passed church property to their children, enriching their families, but impoverishing the church. celibate priests left their property to the church when they died. Enforcement was difficult and unpopular. Priests resisted. Congregations sometimes preferred priests who understood family life to celibate clergy who seemed distant from ordinary concerns. Reform took centuries and was never completely successful. Throughout the medieval period, there were priests who had sexual relationships, some quite openly. The evidence shows up in church records as penalties for concubinage and in the occasional papal dispensation legitimizing a bishop's son so he could inherit a benefice. The broader point is this: the church made rules that were nearly impossible to follow completely, then profited from people's inevitable failure. The system of penance, of confession and absolution, of indulgences and dispensations, all of it required a population of sinners seeking reconciliation. Perfect sexual purity would have undermined the church's power as much as complete libertinism. So the church taught an ideal of virginity and celibacy as the highest spiritual state, marriage as a concession to those who couldn't maintain celibacy, and sex within marriage as something to be minimized and approached with appropriate solemnity. But it also maintained mechanisms for handling the reality that most people, including many clergy, fell well short of these ideals. For ordinary lay people, this created a kind of learned hypocrisy. You knew the rules. You knew you weren't following them. You felt guilty about it, at least sometimes. You confessed, did your penance, and then went back to living your life more or less as before. The rules were there, a framework of sin and penance that everyone navigated according to their own circumstances and conscience. What's fascinating is that alongside all this prohibition and regulation, medieval culture also developed traditions that celebrated love and desire in ways that seemed to contradict church teaching. The most famous of these was courtly love, a literary and cultural phenomenon that emerged in the High Middle Ages and shaped how educated Europeans thought about romance for centuries. Courtly love was strange, almost paradoxical. It was a code of behavior and a literary genre that idealized passionate, romantic love between a knight and a lady. The catch was that the lady was almost always someone else's wife, and the love, at least in theory, was never consummated. The whole point was the yearning, the longing, the exquisite torture of loving someone you could never truly have. This tradition emerged in the courts of southern France and northern Spain in the 11th and 12th centuries. Troubadours, poet-musicians who traveled from court to court, composed elaborate songs about unrequited love. Knights performed great deeds to win the favor of their chosen ladies. The entire culture celebrated this very specific form of romantic devotion. Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century chaplain at the French royal court, wrote what amounts to a handbook of courtly love called De Amore, the art of courtly love. In it, he makes explicit what the poetry implied: true love and marriage cannot coexist. Marriage, he argues, is about obligation and duty. True love requires freedom and choice. Therefore, the highest form of love is necessarily outside marriage. This is radical stuff, and we need to understand how shocking it would have been. Here was a chaplain, a church official, essentially arguing that the deepest, most ennobling love happened in extramarital relationships. He wasn't advocating for dissolving marriages or living in sin. The courtly love code explicitly valued chastity in a sense, but it elevated romantic passion above marital duty and suggested that spiritual growth came through loving the right person intensely, whether you were married to them or not. The poetry and songs of courtly love are beautiful and surprisingly varied. Some emphasize pure spiritual devotion, A knight adores his lady from afar, never presuming to touch her, content with the honor of serving her. Others are much more sensual, describing stolen moments, secret meetings, the danger of discovery. The Alba or Dawn song specifically dealt with lovers parting at daybreak after a night together, the approaching day forcing them to separate. Were these relationships actually consummated? That's the question historians debate. The official courtly love code said no. The love should remain pure and unconsummated. But the poetry suggests otherwise. When troubadours sang about lying beside their beloved, about embraces and the sweetness of her lips, about the risk of being discovered by a jealous husband, it's hard to believe they were only talking about spiritual connection. The most likely reality is that courtly love served different purposes for different people. For some, it was exactly what it claimed to be, a way of channeling romantic and erotic feelings into something spiritually elevating that stopped short of actual adultery. For others, it was a sophisticated code for describing extramarital affairs, giving them poetic legitimacy. The ambiguity was probably intentional, allowing people to engage with the tradition at whatever level they were comfortable with. What's undeniable is that courtly love created a cultural space where loving someone other than your spouse was not just acceptable, but admirable, as long as it was done with appropriate refinement and discretion. This was a direct challenge to church teaching, which condemned any sexual or romantic feeling outside marriage. Yet courtly love flourished in aristocratic courts throughout Europe for centuries, patronized by the very same nobility who were supposed to be the church's most faithful supporters. The tradition also elevated women in interesting ways, at least symbolically. In courtly love literature, the lady held power over her knight. He served at her pleasure, performed deeds to win her approval, suffered exquisitely from her slightest frown. This was a reversal of normal gender hierarchies, where women were legally subordinate to men. It was all fantasy, of course. Noble women in real life had no more legal or political power because poets sang about serving them. But the literary tradition at least imagined a world where women could choose their devotees, grant or withhold favor, based on merit rather than political expedience. Some historians argue that courtly love emerged precisely because arranged marriages were so loveless. It provided an outlet for romantic feelings that had no place in the political marriages that dominated noble life. If you were married to someone you'd never chosen, someone picked for their lands or connections, you might well form a passionate attachment to someone else. Courtly love gave that attachment cultural legitimacy and even spiritual value. The tradition also influenced how people understood love more broadly. The idea that romantic love was ennobling, that it made you a better person, that it inspired great deeds, this came from courtly love and spread through European culture. So did the notion that love involved suffering, yearning, obstacles to overcome. The modern romantic idea that true love must triumph over barriers, that the course of true love never runs smooth, has roots in medieval, courtly love tradition. But we need to be careful not to romanticize this too much or think it applied to everyone. Courtly love was an elite phenomenon, created by and for the nobility. It required leisure time to compose poetry. Courts where such poetry could be performed and appreciated. An audience educated enough to understand the elaborate literary conventions. Peasants didn't participate in this tradition. They were too busy surviving. So what did courtship and romance look like for the vast majority of medieval people, the peasants and urban workers who made up perhaps 90% of the population? very different from the elaborate rituals of courtly love, and much more tied to practical realities of daily life. For peasants living in small agricultural villages, opportunities to meet potential partners were limited but real. Young people worked together in the fields during planting and harvest. They saw each other at the village well or stream where everyone drew water and washed clothes. They encountered each other at market, at church, at the communal oven where bread was baked. And crucially, they participated together in seasonal festivals, celebrations that punctuated the agricultural calendar and provided rare opportunities for recreation, music, dancing, and yes, flirtation. These festivals were important, not just religiously, but socially. Harvest festivals, midsummer celebrations, May Day festivities, Saints' Days. These were times when normal work stopped and the community came together. There would be music, often just someone playing a pipe or drum, but enough to dance to. Dancing was significant because it was one of the few contexts where unmarried young people could touch each other, hold hands, move together in socially acceptable ways. The church was ambivalent about these celebrations. On one hand, many were nominally religious, honoring saints or marking the Christian calendar. On the other hand, they involved behaviors the church found problematic: drinking, dancing, young people staying out late, opportunities for sexual misbehavior. Parish priests regularly condemned the more raucous aspects of festivals, with limited success. The celebrations were too deeply rooted in community life to be easily suppressed. During these festivals, a young man might approach a young woman, ask her to dance, offer her a drink or a small gift. If she accepted, that was encouragement. They might arrange to meet later, somewhere away from the crowd. A walk to the edge of the village, a meeting by the stream, a rendezvous in a barn or field. These encounters were where courtship happened for most people. Brief stolen moments of privacy in lives otherwise lived in full view of family and community. Privacy was the great challenge for peasant romance. Peasant homes were small, typically 1 or 2 rooms shared by an entire family, and sometimes animals as well. Multiple generations might live together. Beds were shared between siblings or parents and children. There was no such thing as a private bedroom where you could close the door and be alone. Every conversation could be overheard. Every movement was visible to someone. This is where the practice of bundling came in, particularly in England, Wales, and parts of Scandinavia. Bundling involved an unmarried couple spending the night together in bed, fully clothed, often with a physical barrier like a board or bundled blanket placed between them. The couple could talk, get to know each other, even sleep side by side, but the barrier was supposed to prevent sexual contact. Why would parents allow this? Partly because courtship had to happen somehow, and there were few other opportunities for a couple to spend time alone together. Winter nights were long and cold. Heating fuel was expensive. Rather than waste heat on a separate fire for the courting couple to sit by, practical parents put them in the one warm bed, with safeguards to preserve the girl's virginity. The logic was economic as much as romantic. Did bundling actually prevent sex? Sometimes, certainly. Medieval people took virginity seriously, and the consequences of premarital pregnancy could be severe. But human nature being what it is, not all couples restrained themselves. Parish records show a notable number of firstborn children arriving suspiciously soon after marriage, sometimes just 6 or 7 months later. These early babies were common enough to suggest bundling didn't always work as intended. The church officially disapproved of bundling and premarital sex generally, but it also recognized a practical reality. If a betrothed couple had sex, they were considered married in the eyes of God. Consent and consummation created a valid marriage even without a church ceremony. So while such behavior required confession and penance, it wasn't the catastrophic sin that casual fornication was. The couple was going to marry anyway. They just anticipated their vows. This gets at something important about medieval marriage law that often confuses people. The church taught that marriage was created by the free consent of both parties. If a man and woman of legal age both agreed to marry each other, speaking vows in the present tense, they were married. No priest required, no church ceremony necessary, no witnesses even, though they were strongly recommended. The consent itself created the marriage. This meant that informal or clandestine marriages were technically valid, even though the church tried to discourage them. A couple might exchange vows privately, consummate the marriage, and consider themselves wed without ever setting foot in a church. This caused enormous problems because it was impossible to prove or disprove. Did they actually exchange vows, or is she lying to trap him into marriage? Ecclesiastical courts spent substantial time adjudicating marriage disputes, trying to determine whether valid marriages had occurred. The church tried to fix this with publicity requirements. Bans were supposed to be read, announcements of the intended marriage made publicly in church for 3 consecutive Sundays, giving anyone who knew of an impediment, a prior marriage, too close blood relation, time to object. But in practice, couples often married first and dealt with bans later, or skipped them entirely if they were in a hurry or didn't care about church approval. For peasants, the negotiation leading to marriage was more direct than among the nobility, but still involved families. A young man interested in marrying would approach the woman's father, either directly or through an intermediary. He'd need to demonstrate that he could support a wife, that he had land or a trade or steady employment. The woman's father would consider whether this was a good match, whether combining their households made economic sense. If both families agreed, they'd negotiate the specifics. What would the bride bring to the marriage? Not a large dowry like nobility paid, but perhaps some household goods, a spinning wheel, a few chickens, maybe a small plot of land if the family had any to spare. What would the groom provide? A cottage, however humble, or at least a plan for where they'd live. Tools of his trade if he was a craftsman. The promise to support her and any children. Once terms were agreed, the couple might become formally betrothed, a binding agreement to marry that could only be broken for serious cause. The betrothal itself was sometimes celebrated with a small gathering, an exchange of tokens, rings or other small gifts symbolizing the commitment. Then would come the waiting period until the actual marriage, time to save money for the wedding celebration, to gather household necessities, to prepare for the transition to married life. The wedding itself, when it finally happened, was a community event even for poor peasants. There would be a church ceremony if the couple could afford the priest's fees, though, as mentioned, many couldn't and married informally. Either way, there was usually some kind of celebration, a feast however modest, music and dancing, the community gathering to witness and bless the new union. Were these relationships actually chaste? That's the million-dollar question, or perhaps the million-ducat question. The literary ideal said yes, that true courtly love was about spiritual elevation through romantic devotion, not physical satisfaction. But the poetry itself tells a different story. There are too many references to beds and embraces, to skin and kisses, to the fear of being caught together. The Alba songs make no sense unless lovers are actually spending nights together. Historians debate this endlessly. Some argue courtly love was essentially an elaborate code for adultery, a way of talking about and justifying extramarital affairs without saying so explicitly. Others insist it really was primarily platonic, a literary convention that idealized love precisely because it remained unconsummated. The truth probably varies by individual case. Some courtly relationships were likely pure devotion, without physical intimacy. Others were certainly sexual affairs dressed up in poetic language. What's clear is that aristocratic society in the High Middle Ages created a culture that romanticized loving someone other than your spouse, that made such relationships not just acceptable, but admirable, as long as they were conducted with proper etiquette and expressed in beautiful poetry. This was extraordinary in a society where the church condemned any form of extramarital desire. The courtly love tradition had real effects on how nobles approached relationships. It created a vocabulary for romantic feeling that hadn't existed before. It established that women could be objects of devotion and respect, not just vessels for producing heirs. It suggested that men could be improved, ennobled even, by romantic love. These ideas filtered down through society, influencing how people thought about attraction and devotion even centuries later. But courtly love was fundamentally an aristocratic phenomenon. It required leisure time for writing poetry, court settings for reciting it, a social structure that kept married couples in proximity to potential lovers. Peasants didn't have troubadours. They were too busy surviving to spend days composing verses about unrequited longing. Yet peasants still fell in love, still pursued romance, though it looked very different from the courtly ideal. Let's step away from castle halls and enter the village, where most medieval people actually lived, and where romance, such as it existed, was much more practical. Peasant life was brutally hard. You woke before dawn and worked until you couldn't see anymore. You worked the fields, tended animals, hauled water, chopped wood, spun thread, wove cloth, all the endless labor required to keep body and soul together. There was no time for elaborate courtship rituals. Romance happened, if at all, in the margins of exhausting days. Young people in villages did have opportunities to meet, though. They worked together in the fields during harvest. They saw each other at church on Sundays, the one day of rest. They attended village festivals, celebrations of saints' days or seasonal markers like May Day or Harvest Home. These festivals often involved music and dancing, rare moments of levity in otherwise grinding routines. Dancing was important. It brought young people into physical contact in a socially acceptable context. A village dance wasn't a private date. Everyone was there, but it still allowed for flirtation. You could hold hands while dancing in a circle. You could choose to dance with someone specific, showing interest. Conversations could happen, jokes shared, connections made. The church generally disapproved of dancing, viewing it as an occasion for sin. Dancing led to touching. Touching led to desire. Desire led to fornication. But dancing persisted anyway because people needed joy, needed moments of release, needed ways to meet potential partners. Village priests often looked the other way, recognizing that completely suppressing such activities was both impossible and counterproductive. Beyond festivals, young people met at markets, at the village well where water was drawn, in the fields during breaks from work. These encounters were brief and usually not private, but they allowed for conversation, for getting to know someone. If a young man was interested in a woman, he might contrive to be at the well when she came for water. She might linger there, talking longer than necessary if she was interested in return. Courtship gifts were common across social classes, though peasant gifts were necessarily humble. A young man might give a woman ribbons bought at market, or food from a successful hunt, or a useful tool he'd made. If she accepted the gifts, she was signaling interest. If she refused, or gave them back, the message was equally clear. Some villages practice bundling, that curious custom we mentioned earlier, where an unmarried couple would spend the night in bed together, fully clothed, often with a physical barrier between them. The idea was they could talk and get to know each other in the only place that offered any warmth during cold Northern European nights. Did bundling lead to sex? Sometimes, certainly. The practice wouldn't have needed so much regulation and condemnation from church authorities if it were completely innocent, but it also served a legitimate purpose. In peasant cottages where privacy didn't exist and multiple generations shared one or two rooms, there was literally nowhere else for a courting couple to talk alone. The bed with a bundling board at least gave them time together, even if it was supposed to be chaste. When peasant couples did have sex before marriage, the consequences depended on several factors. If the woman became pregnant and the man was willing to marry her, that often solved the problem. A rushed wedding followed by a 7-month baby wasn't ideal, but it was better than the alternatives. The church would impose penance for fornication, some fasting and prayers, but the couple would be accepted back into the community. If the man refused to marry, things got more complicated. The woman could try to force the issue through church courts, especially if she could prove they'd exchanged promises to marry. A betrothal promise, followed by sex, constituted a legal marriage in church law, even without a formal ceremony. Many court cases revolved around exactly this issue. Had the couple exchanged vows or just casual words? Had they committed fornication or consummated a marriage? These cases reveal the messy reality of peasant romance. A man might promise marriage to convince a woman to sleep with him, then claim afterward he'd said no such thing. A woman might insist they'd exchanged vows when they'd merely discussed the possibility. Both might be lying, or confused, or remembering things differently. The courts had to sort through conflicting testimony and try to determine truth. For women, the stakes were higher. An unmarried pregnant woman faced social stigma, economic hardship, and a future where her marriage prospects were severely damaged. Some women in this situation turned to desperate measures, herbal abortifacients, if they could get them, claiming rape rather than admitting consensual sex, fleeing to another village where their history wasn't known. The least fortunate might resort to infanticide, smothering a newborn they couldn't afford to keep. But not all premarital sex led to pregnancy, and not all peasant romance was tragic. Some couples did genuinely court, fall in love, and marry with their family's blessing. Some marriages that started as practical arrangements developed real affection over time. The grinding hardship of peasant life didn't prevent human connection. In some ways, it made it more precious. When your life is hard, someone to share it with, someone who understands your struggles, that companionship has enormous value. Peasant marriages also had advantages over noble ones. Because they weren't primarily political, they could be based on compatibility. Because peasants married later on average than nobles, often in their early to mid-20s rather than their teens, they were more mature and had more say in the choice. Because both partners contributed essential labor, there was often more equality, at least in practice, if not in law. The actual wedding itself, for peasants who could afford one, was a community celebration. There'd be a church ceremony, briefer and simpler than for the nobility. Then a feast, paid for by contributions from family and neighbors. Dancing, drinking, charivari processions with rough music and bawdy jokes. The wedding night was semi-public in many traditions, with guests escorting the couple to their bed, making lewd comments, sometimes staying to witness the consummation or at least hear evidence of it through the door. This public aspect of marriage, the community involvement in what we'd consider intensely private moments, was normal in a society where privacy barely existed. Your neighbors knew your business because they lived right next to you, worked alongside you, saw you every day. A wedding was the community recognizing and celebrating a new household, and that gave the community certain rights and responsibilities toward that household. If we shift our attention from villages to towns and cities, we find a different sexual culture emerging, especially in the later medieval period as urban areas grew. Cities offered something villages didn't: anonymity. In a village, everyone knew everyone and their business. In a city, especially a large one like Paris or London or Florence, you could be anonymous. This anonymity created opportunities for sexual encounters that would have been impossible in the countryside. Cities also concentrated certain types of people: merchants traveling for trade, university students living away from family oversight, apprentices crowded into workshops, servants in wealthy households. All these groups had limited marriage prospects in the short term, plenty of sexual desire, and the anonymity to act on it without immediate family or community surveillance. Prostitution flourished in medieval cities, and it was surprisingly regulated and accepted, at least officially. We need to talk about this carefully because modern attitudes towards sex work are complex and contested. But the medieval situation was different from anything we know today. Many medieval cities had licensed brothels, officially sanctioned establishments where prostitution was legal and regulated. These weren't hidden or shameful. They operated openly, often in designated red light districts. The logic behind legalization was pragmatic. Men would seek sexual outlets whether the authorities approved or not. So better to regulate prostitution than have it happening in uncontrolled ways. The most famous example is Southwark, the district across the Thames from London. Southwark was outside London's direct jurisdiction, but under the control of the Bishop of Winchester. And the bishop, in what might seem like stunning hypocrisy, licensed and profited from brothels. The prostitutes who worked there were called Winchester geese, a reference to the bishop's ownership of the properties. The bishop's Southwark brothels operated under detailed regulations. Prostitutes couldn't solicit too aggressively. They couldn't work on holy days. They couldn't force customers to stay against their will. They had to submit to inspections for disease. Violating these rules meant fines, which went to the bishop. The whole system was lucrative. The bishop earned substantial income from rent and fines, enough that some estimates suggest his Southwark properties were among his most profitable holdings. Other cities had similar systems. Paris had licensed brothels. So did Rome, Florence, Venice. These municipal brothels were supposed to be well run, with the women housed and fed, protected from abuse, allowed to keep their earnings after paying rent and fees. In practice, of course, the reality was often much worse. Brothel keepers exploited the women, taking most of their earnings. Customers could be violent. Disease was rampant. The work was dangerous and degrading. Who were the women working as prostitutes? They came from various backgrounds, but poverty was the common thread. Some were orphans with no family support and no other way to survive. Some were servants who'd been raped by their masters and turned out when they became pregnant. Some had fled abusive families or marriages. Some had chosen the work, recognizing it paid better than the alternatives available to poor women. Domestic service, textile work, agricultural labor, all of which were backbreaking and paid almost nothing. The church officially condemned prostitution as fornication, a mortal sin, but it also tacitly accepted it as a social necessity. St. Augustine had written that prostitutes were like sewers in a palace, unpleasant but necessary to prevent worse contamination. St. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most influential medieval theologian, repeated this idea. Remove prostitution, he argued, and you'd see an increase in rape, adultery, sodomy, all worse sins than simple fornication. This logic meant prostitutes occupied a strange position. They were necessary but degraded. They could work legally but faced social stigma. They had to wear identifying clothing, often yellow hoods or stripes, marking them as different. They couldn't attend regular church services without permission. They couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. They were tolerated, but never respectable. The church did make efforts to save prostitutes. Magdalene houses, named after Mary Magdalene, who medieval tradition incorrectly identified as a prostitute, offered women a path out of sex work. If a woman entered a Magdalene house and spent a year or two there, learning a respectable trade like spinning or weaving, she could rejoin society, her past theoretically forgiven. Some women did this and successfully transitioned to other lives, sometimes even marrying. But Magdalene houses had their own problems. They were often run like convents, with strict discipline and long hours of tedious work. The training provided, usually textile production, prepared women for one of the lowest paid, most exhausting forms of labor available. Many women found it difficult to survive on weavers' wages after getting used to the higher income from prostitution, even with all its dangers and indignities. Beyond organized prostitution, cities offered venues for more casual sexual encounters. Taverns served alcohol and sometimes offered rooms that could be rented by the hour. Some tavern workers supplemented their income with sex work. Bathhouses, which had started as places for hygiene, increasingly acquired reputations as sites of prostitution. The connection became so strong that in English, the word stew, meaning a heated bath, became slang for a brothel. These bathhouses were interesting institutions. In the early medieval period, public bathing was common and respectable, continuing Roman traditions. Large tubs of heated water where people could wash, relax, socialize. But by the High Middle Ages, many bathhouses had become mixed-use establishments. You could still bathe, but you could also find sexual services. This mixing of hygiene and sex probably happened gradually. Bath attendants would offer massages as part of the bathing service. Some attendants were women, and the intimacy of washing someone, of touching their body, the line between professional service and sexual service could blur. Enterprising bathhouse owners realized they could profit from both services. Soon, some establishments were essentially brothels that also offered baths. The church periodically tried to crack down on bathhouses, viewing them as dens of sin. After the Black Death in the 14th century, many bathhouses were closed over concerns about disease spread, but they persisted in various forms throughout the medieval period, testament to the demand for both the official and unofficial services they provided. Universities were another urban institution that affected sexual culture. Medieval universities were unlike modern ones in many ways, but one similarity was that they concentrated large numbers of young men away from family oversight. Students lived in relative freedom, supported by allowances from home or by working. They attended lectures and studied, but they also drank, gambled, and pursued women. University students had a notorious reputation. They were seen as rowdy, disrespectful, prone to violence and debauchery. This wasn't entirely fair. Many students were serious scholars, but enough of them fit the stereotype to give all students a bad name. They frequented taverns and brothels. They had affairs with local women. They sometimes forced themselves on women, relying on clerical privilege, the legal exemption that let university-affiliated men be tried in church courts rather than secular ones, to avoid serious consequences. The relationship between university students and townspeople was often tense. Town and gown conflicts, violence between students and local residents, erupted periodically. Sometimes these started over women, students insulting local women or having affairs that ended badly, local men retaliating. The universities tried to regulate student behavior with limited success. All of this urban sexual culture, the licensed brothels and casual prostitution, the bathhouses and taverns, the student affairs and servant liaisons existed alongside the official church teaching that all sex outside marriage was sinful. The contradiction was obvious and widely acknowledged. Cities were seen as morally dangerous, places where the anonymity and mixing of social classes created opportunities for sin. But cities were also economically necessary. Trade happened there. Crafts were produced there. Money flowed through them. So the authorities, both secular and religious, tried to manage urban sexuality rather than eliminate it. Regulate prostitution, zone it to certain districts, tax it, punish the most egregious violations, public scandals, and rapes and violence, while looking the other way at what happened in private. This pragmatic approach reflects something important about medieval sexuality generally: the enormous gap between ideal and practice. The church taught one thing, people did another, and institutions found ways to manage the disconnect without addressing it directly. Now, we need to talk about something that medieval sources often mention only to condemn: same-sex relationships. Our knowledge here is limited because most surviving sources are either religious texts condemning such relationships or legal documents prosecuting them. The voices of people actually engaged in same-sex intimacy are mostly absent, but we can piece together some understanding. The medieval church categorized all non-procreative sexual acts as sodomy, a catch-all term that included anal sex, oral sex, masturbation, bestiality, and any sexual position other than missionary. Same-sex activity fell under this umbrella, condemned as sinful and against nature. The condemnation was consistent and harsh in official church teaching, but actual prosecution was spotty and often driven by other agendas. The most famous case was the trial of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century, where the order was accused of ritual sodomy, among other charges. Most historians believe these accusations were fabricated by King Philip IV of France, who wanted to destroy the Templars and seize their wealth. The confessions were extracted through torture and should be viewed with extreme skepticism. What we do know is that same-sex relationships existed throughout the medieval period. Poetry from the 11th and 12th centuries, written by bishops like Marbod of Rennes, contains explicitly homoerotic themes. These weren't crude jokes or condemnations. They were love poetry addressed to young men, celebrating their beauty, expressing longing and devotion. When confronted about this poetry, Marbod claimed it was metaphorical, spiritual friendship expressed in classical forms. Maybe that's true, or maybe it's what he had to say when questioned about poetry that clearly expressed desire. The poems exist, beautiful and passionate, addressed to specific young men by name. Draw your own conclusions. Monastic communities, where men or women live together in close quarters, sometimes form deep emotional bonds that may have had physical dimensions. The evidence is fragmentary and often comes from warnings issued by church authorities. Don't sleep in the same bed. Don't spend too much time alone together. Don't touch each other inappropriately. The need for these warnings suggests the behavior they prohibited was happening. There was also a ceremony called adelphopoiesis, literally brother-making, that bound two men in spiritual brotherhood. The ceremony borrowed elements from wedding rites and created a permanent bond between the participants. The late historian John Boswell controversially argued this was essentially a same-sex marriage ceremony. Other scholars have pushed back hard on this interpretation, insisting it was purely platonic friendship. The truth is probably complex. Some of these spiritual brotherhoods were likely platonic. Others may have included romantic or sexual dimensions. Medieval people didn't think about sexual orientation the way we do, as fixed identities. The modern categories of gay, straight, bisexual wouldn't have made sense to them, but desire between people of the same sex certainly existed, and some people acted on it. For women, the evidence is even scarcer. Medieval society was male-centered, and lesbian relationships were often dismissed as impossible or not really sex because they didn't involve penetration by a penis. The few references come from religious texts warning against nuns sharing beds or engaging in specific physical contact. Interestingly, medieval Arabic sources from Muslim Spain are more open about same-sex relationships. While still technically sinful in Islamic law, they were treated as minor transgressions. Medieval Arabic poetry celebrated same-sex love with remarkable frankness. The 13th century Tunisian poet Al-Tifashi wrote detailed descriptions of sexual acts between women. The 15th century traveller Leo Africanus wrote about lesbian communities. This more tolerant attitude in Islamic culture meant that medieval Spain, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in proximity, likely had more complex and varied sexual cultures than purely Christian regions of Europe. The interplay between these cultures, the translation of Arabic texts into Latin, this cross-pollination influenced European attitudes, though exactly how is difficult to trace. By the late medieval period, prosecution of same-sex activity became more severe and more common. Cities like Florence and Venice created special courts to investigate sodomy. Punishments could include heavy fines, public humiliation, exile, or execution. This intensification seems connected to broader social changes. Urbanization bringing more people into close contact, religious reform movements emphasizing sexual purity, perhaps a backlash against the more permissive attitudes of earlier centuries. But even with increased prosecution, most same-sex activity remained private and undetected. What happened behind closed doors, between consenting adults, was difficult for authorities to discover unless someone reported it. And despite the harsh penalties on paper, many communities weren't eager to prosecute their neighbors for private behavior that didn't affect anyone else. Let's shift to something more mundane, but absolutely crucial: How did medieval people actually prevent pregnancy? Because despite church teaching that procreation was the sole, legitimate purpose of sex, many people, probably most people, didn't want a new baby every year. The simplest method was coitus interruptus, withdrawal before ejaculation. This shows up in the Bible in the story of Onan, and medieval people certainly knew about it. It required no special preparation, cost nothing, and with careful use could be reasonably effective. It was also explicitly condemned by the church, which suggests it was widely practiced. Beyond withdrawal, women had access to various herbal contraceptives. This knowledge was part of women's folk medicine, passed from mothers to daughters, from midwives to their communities. Certain plants had anti-fertility properties that modern science has confirmed. Queen Anne's lace, pennyroyal, rue, tansy, silphium in the ancient world. These could be prepared as teas or pessaries and used to prevent conception or bring on menstruation if it was late. The effectiveness varied. Some of these herbs are genuinely contraceptive. Others are primarily abortifacient, causing miscarriage rather than preventing conception. The doses had to be carefully calibrated. Too little, and they didn't work. Too much, and they could be poisonous. Women sometimes died from taking abortifacient herbs, their bodies poisoned in the attempt to end unwanted pregnancies. There were also barrier methods. A pessary of wool or cloth soaked in honey, vinegar, or other substances could be inserted before intercourse. The honey's stickiness would impede sperm, and vinegar has mild spermicidal properties. How common these methods were is impossible to know, but they appear in medical texts, suggesting at least some educated people knew about them. The church condemned all of this absolutely. Any attempt to prevent conception was interfering with God's plan, essentially murder of potential life. Using herbs or barriers, practicing withdrawal. These were grave sins requiring confession and penance. But people did it anyway because the alternative, bearing a child every year, meant poverty, malnutrition, and high maternal mortality. Medieval women faced extraordinary risks from pregnancy and childbirth. Medical knowledge was limited. Sanitation was poor. Complicated births often meant death for mother, child, or both. A woman who bore 10 or 12 children over her fertile years had a substantial chance of dying in childbirth eventually. Fear of pregnancy was rational and well-founded. So despite church prohibition, contraceptive knowledge circulated among women. Midwives knew it. Older women taught younger ones. It was part of a whole body of women's medical knowledge that existed alongside, but separate from official, male-dominated medicine. This knowledge was sometimes condemned as witchcraft, and the association between midwives and accusations of witchcraft in the late medieval period may be partly because midwives knew too much about controlling fertility. When contraception failed and a woman found herself pregnant, abortion was sometimes attempted. This was even more dangerous than contraception, both medically and legally. The church defined life as beginning at conception or shortly after, making abortion murder. Some secular authorities imposed severe penalties, including execution. But abortion happened. Herbs in higher doses, the same ones used for contraception. Physical methods, heavy lifting, jumping, deliberate falls, even more invasive and dangerous techniques. Some women survived. Others died from the herb's toxicity or from infection following physical trauma. An unmarried pregnant woman faced particularly dire circumstances. If the father could be identified and compelled to marry her, that might save her reputation. But if he fled or refused, she faced motherhood alone, which usually meant poverty and social ostracism. Her child would be illegitimate, unable to inherit, marked by bastardy for life. Some women abandoned their babies at churches or monasteries, hoping they'd be taken in. Some sold them or gave them to childless couples. The most desperate committed infanticide, though this was difficult to prove and prosecute because infant mortality was so high that one more dead baby might not raise suspicion. For wealthy women, illegitimate pregnancy had different solutions. Families might arrange a quick marriage, the baby conveniently premature. Or they'd send the daughter away to give birth in secret, the child fostered somewhere distant. Or she might enter a convent, dedicating her life to God in penance for her sin, removed from society where she couldn't cause further scandal. The church's system of confession and penance provided a mechanism for dealing with all these sexual sins. You could use contraception, confess it, do penance, and be reconciled. The penance might be harsh, days of fasting, reciting prayers, but it was a path back to grace. This system acknowledged that people would sin while maintaining the church's authority as the necessary intermediary between sinners and salvation. It's worth stepping back and considering what all these rules and violations tell us about medieval sexuality. On one hand, you have this incredibly restrictive framework: sex only in marriage, only for procreation, only in specific positions, only on approved days. Desire itself is suspect. Pleasure is sinful. The church claims authority over the most intimate aspects of life. On the other hand, you have massive non-compliance. People marry for love despite family pressure. They have affairs despite marriage vows. They use contraception despite church prohibition. They pursue same-sex relationships despite condemnation. They find moments of pleasure and connection despite all the obstacles. The gap between ideal and practice was so wide that everyone, including church authorities, had to find ways to manage it. The confession system let people sin and be forgiven. Regulations around prostitution acknowledged that some sexual outlets would exist, whether approved or not. Turning a blind eye to violations that didn't cause public scandal allowed people to live their lives while maintaining the fiction of compliance. What we're seeing is the eternal tension between social control and human nature. Societies can try to regulate sexuality, channel it, minimize it. They can create elaborate rules backed by the threat of damnation. But they can't eliminate desire. They can't prevent people from finding ways to connect, to love, to pursue pleasure. The rules shape behavior, certainly. They create guilt and fear and suffering. But they don't succeed in completely containing the thing they're trying to control. Medieval people navigated this tension in countless individual ways. Some internalized the rules and struggled with guilt every time they felt desire. Others largely ignored the rules and did what they wanted, confessing occasionally to clear their conscience. Most fell somewhere in between, following some rules, breaking others, doing their best to balance their own needs and desires against the demands of church and society. It's also worth noting that medieval attitudes towards sexuality changed significantly over the 1,000-year period we're discussing. Early medieval Christianity, influenced by the chaos and violence following Rome's collapse, emphasized sexual restraint, but wasn't as obsessively regulatory as it became later. The church was still forming its doctrines, still working out how to apply Christian principles to everyday life. The High Middle Ages, roughly 1000 to 1300 AD, saw an intensification of concern with sexual purity. This was the period of church reform movements that emphasized clerical celibacy, the period when courtly love emerged as a cultural force, when canon law was systematized and confession made mandatory, when the boundaries between acceptable and sinful sexuality became more strictly defined. The late medieval period, after the Black Death in the mid-14th century, saw further changes. The plague killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, causing massive social disruption. Labor shortages gave working people more economic freedom. Traditional social hierarchies were questioned. In this context, some sexual restrictions loosened even as others tightened. For example, the practice of bundling seems to have become more common in the late medieval period, possibly because young people were marrying later and needed ways to spend time together. But prosecution of same-sex activity also intensified, with more cities creating special courts to investigate sodomy. It's complicated and contradictory, as most aspects of medieval sexuality were. Regional variation also mattered enormously. Scandinavian countries retained elements of pre-Christian sexual culture longer than Southern Europe. Marriage customs in Iceland were different from those in Italy. The presence of Jewish and Muslim communities created different sexual cultures in Spain and parts of southern Italy than existed in purely Christian regions of Northern Europe. We should briefly acknowledge the different standards applied to men and women, because the double standard was both stark and deeply embedded in law and culture. A man who had sex before marriage was sinning, yes, but he was also just being a man, following his naturally stronger sexual urges. A woman who did the same was fundamentally damaged, her honor destroyed, her value as a bride diminished or eliminated. This wasn't just social prejudice, though it was certainly that. It was encoded in law. A man could usually get away with sexual transgressions that would ruin a woman. The consequences for female adultery were much harsher than for male. A man's sexual history before marriage didn't affect his marriage prospects. A woman's absolutely did. The reasoning was partly about property and inheritance. A man needed to know that his children were actually his, so that his property would pass to his own bloodline. A wife's sexual fidelity guaranteed this. A husband's fidelity was nice, but not legally necessary. This logic ignored the emotional dimension, the betrayal and hurt of infidelity, focusing purely on the material consequences. The double standard also reflected deeper beliefs about male and female nature. Women were seen as more prone to temptation, daughters of Eve who had caused humanity's fall, but they were also supposed to be more chaste, more modest, more restrained. They were simultaneously seen as dangerously sexual and required to be asexual. This contradiction put women in an impossible position, always wrong whether they expressed desire or repressed it. For men, sexual desire was natural, even though it needed to be controlled. For women, sexual desire was suspect, shameful, something to be suppressed. A woman who enjoyed sex, even with her husband, risked being seen as lustful, immodest. The ideal wife was simultaneously sexually available to her husband when he wanted her and sexually passive, never initiating, never expressing too much enthusiasm. These attitudes had real consequences for how women experienced sexuality in relationships. A woman couldn't openly pursue someone she was attracted to without risking her reputation. She couldn't express sexual desire without seeming improper. She had to navigate between being available enough to attract a husband, but not so available as to seem unchaste. Men had more freedom, but also more expectation. A young man was supposed to sow wild oats, have some sexual experience before marriage. But he was also supposed to control himself enough not to cause scandal. He could visit prostitutes, but discreetly. He could have affairs, but not with respectable married women who might get pregnant and create inheritance tangles. As we move toward concluding this long exploration of medieval sexuality and romance, let's return to the question we started with. Was there anything like modern hookup culture in the Middle Ages? The answer is complicated. There were certainly casual sexual encounters. Prostitution was exactly that. Sex without emotional commitment. Affairs between nobles, while dressed up in courtly love language, were sometimes purely physical. University students and local women sometimes had brief liaisons that meant nothing beyond the moment. So in that sense, yes, people had sex without expectation of marriage or long-term commitment. But the framework was completely different. There was no concept of casual sex being morally neutral. It was always sinful, always carried risk, always potentially had serious consequences. For women especially, the risk of pregnancy, the damage to reputation, the possibility of violence or abandonment, these made casual sex dangerous in ways that modern birth control and social safety nets have largely eliminated. The very idea of choosing partners based on attraction and compatibility, of dating multiple people to find the right one, of building a romantic relationship that might or might not lead to marriage, this didn't exist. You didn't casually date. You either pursued marriage, which was a serious business involving families and property, or you engaged in behavior that was defined as sinful and shameful. What medieval people did have was creativity in pursuing desire despite obstacles. They found moments alone in a world without privacy. They developed codes and signals for communicating interest. They took risks for connection and pleasure. They fell in love even when it was inconvenient, impractical, or dangerous. They were, in other words, beautifully, stubbornly human. The medieval world tried very hard to control sexuality, to channel it exclusively into procreative marriage, to minimize pleasure and desire. It failed, as such attempts always do, because human sexuality is too powerful and too varied to be completely contained by rules and prohibitions. But the attempt shaped countless lives, created immense suffering, and also, paradoxically, inspired some of the most beautiful love poetry and romantic literature in Western culture. When we look back at medieval romance and sexuality from our modern vantage point, it's easy to focus on the restrictions, the double standards, the lack of freedom, and those things were real and often devastating. But it's also worth recognizing the persistence of human connection despite everything. People still loved, still desired, still found each other and built lives together, still experienced moments of transcendent joy and devastating heartbreak. The forms were different, the language was different, the consequences were often more severe, but the underlying emotions, the racing heart and sweaty palms, the longing and hope and fear, those haven't changed. A medieval peasant girl waiting by the well for a boy she liked felt the same flutter of anticipation that a modern person feels waiting for a text back. A knight writing poetry for his unattainable lady poured out the same desperate yearning that fills breakup songs today. Medieval people lived in a world that seems impossibly distant from ours, governed by rules we can barely understand, shaped by beliefs that feel alien. But they were people, just like us. They wanted to be seen and known and desired. They wanted connection and intimacy. They wanted love in all its messy, complicated, glorious forms. The structures have changed, The possibilities have expanded. The consequences are less severe. But the fundamental human drive to connect with another person that's remained constant across the centuries. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of our journey through medieval romance and sexuality. Technology changes, laws change, social structures change, but the human heart wants what it wants, now as always. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in a world where you have freedoms medieval people couldn't imagine, take a moment to appreciate them. The ability to choose your own partner, to love who you want, to have sex without religious oversight or social catastrophe, to kiss someone just because you both want to. These freedoms are precious, hard-won, and relatively recent. Medieval people would have found our world astonishing. The idea that you could swipe through faces on a screen, meet a stranger for coffee, decide you're compatible, and build a relationship entirely based on mutual attraction and choice. This would have seemed like fantasy. The notion that women could own property, pursue careers, choose not to marry at all, this would have been revolutionary, but they would have recognized the feelings. The nervousness before a first date, the joy of requited affection, the pain of rejection or betrayal, the comfort of lying beside someone you love. These experiences transcend time and culture. They're part of being human, as true in a medieval village as in a modern city. There are still other stories worth telling, details worth exploring, aspects of medieval romance and sexuality that deserve more attention. Let's linger a bit longer in this distant world. We should talk more about the practical mechanics of courtship among different social classes, because the devil, as they say, is in the details. For noble families, courtship wasn't just arranged, it was choreographed, a carefully staged performance with clear rules about who could say what to whom and when. A noble girl reaching marriageable age, remember that's around 12 to 14 by church law, though sometimes older in practice, would suddenly find herself the subject of intense parental scrutiny. Her clothing, her behavior, her interactions with men, all of it became carefully monitored. She was being prepared for display, essentially, her value on the marriage market tied to her reputation for modesty, beauty, piety, and most crucially, virginity. When a potential match was identified, negotiations began between families, often before the young people involved had any idea. Intermediaries might be used, trusted servants or relatives who could discreetly sound out the other family's interest. Letters would be exchanged, formal documents outlining the proposed terms. What property would the bride bring? What would the groom's family settle on her? How many children were expected? What happened if she proved barren? Only after these preliminary negotiations showed promise would the actual couple meet, and that first meeting was anything but private. It would happen in a hall full of witnesses, families present on both sides, servants hovering. The young man and woman might exchange a few words, carefully supervised. They'd be able to see each other, assess physical appearance, manner, voice. But nothing approaching a conversation would be possible. If both families were satisfied, more meetings would follow, still supervised, but perhaps slightly less formal. They might walk in a garden with chaperones trailing at a discreet distance. They might sit together at a feast, though never alone. All of this was designed to let them become somewhat familiar with each other, while preventing any impropriety that might damage the bride's reputation, or worse, lead to pregnancy before the marriage contract was finalized. For the young woman, this process must have been surreal. She was being presented like a piece of valuable merchandise, smiled at and assessed, her opinions irrelevant except insofar as outright rebellion might scuttle the deal. If she was fortunate, her future husband would be reasonably pleasant, close to her in age, not actively cruel. If she was less fortunate, well, she'd learn to endure. The engagement itself, once families agreed, became legally binding. Breaking an engagement was possible but difficult and potentially expensive. The formal betrothal ceremony involved exchanging vows and often rings, though these vows were in the future tense. I will marry you, rather than the present tense, I marry you, used in the actual wedding. This distinction mattered legally. A betrothal could be broken, though with consequences. A marriage, once consummated, could not. Between betrothal and wedding, the couple might exchange letters if they were literate, though even these were probably read by family members. They might exchange gifts, love tokens as they were called, ribbons or rings or small carved objects. These tokens served as tangible proof of the engagement and as objects the bride could treasure, physical reminders that someone, somewhere, was thinking of her even if that someone was a near stranger. The wedding itself was a major event. The bigger the families involved, the more elaborate the celebration. Weddings among the highest nobility might last days, with tournaments, feasts, entertainments. The ceremony would happen in church, though, interestingly, until the 16th century Council of Trent, the church wedding wasn't strictly necessary. A couple could marry validly just by exchanging present tense vows. I marry you, anywhere, at any time. But by the later medieval period, church weddings were the norm, at least for those who could afford them. After the ceremony came the wedding feast, and after the feast, the bedding ceremony. This tradition horrifies modern sensibilities, but was perfectly normal in medieval culture. The bride and groom would be escorted to their marriage bed by the wedding guests, undressed by attendants, and put to bed together. Guests might stay in the room or just outside, making bawdy jokes, offering unsolicited advice, waiting for evidence that consummation had occurred. This public aspect of consummation served several purposes. It witnessed the marriage's completion, important because an unconsummated marriage could be annulled. It provided evidence that the bride was a virgin. The bloody sheet might be displayed as proof. And it reinforced the communal nature of marriage. This wasn't just about two people, it was about families, alliances, the social fabric being rewoven. For the bride, who was often very young and probably terrified, this must have been traumatic. She's in a room full of relative strangers being undressed and put to bed with a man she barely knows, expected to engage in an act she probably knows little about, while people listen and wait for proof she's done it. The groom at least had the authority of his position and gender, not to mention likely more sexual experience. The bride just had to endure. Not all noble marriages involve such public beddings. Practices varied by region and period. But the expectation that consummation happened quickly and provably was widespread. A marriage wasn't truly a marriage until it had been consummated, and families wanted that security. For peasant courtship, the process was completely different, looser and more flexible because there was less at stake materially. A peasant girl reaching marriageable age, usually later than noble girls, early 20s rather than early teens, would be working alongside young men regularly. In the fields during planting and harvest, at village festivals, at church. She'd know the eligible men in her village, know their families, their reputations, their prospects. If a young man was interested in a girl, he might seek opportunities to work near her, to talk during breaks, to walk the same path home from the fields. His interest would be noted by others, village life being what it was, and that social pressure could work for or against him. If the girl's family approved of him, things were easier. If they didn't, he might find himself prevented from approaching her, father and brothers running interference. But peasant children had more say in their own marriages than noble ones, simply because peasant marriages had less economic and political significance. Parents cared who their children married, certainly. A daughter needed a husband who could provide. A son needed a wife who could work. But the difference between one peasant suitor and another was often minimal in material terms. Compatibility, affection, these could matter more. Peasant courtship might involve the young man visiting the girl's home in the evening after work, sitting with the family, talking, helping with chores to show he was a good worker. Gradually, if things went well, more time alone might be allowed, though still supervised. Eventually, if both parties were agreeable and families consented, a betrothal would be arranged. These betrothals were legally binding even without formal documentation. Exchanging present tense vows, "I marry you," in front of witnesses created a valid marriage in church law. Many peasant couples married this way, through simple verbal contracts, and only later, if they could afford it, solemnized the union with a church ceremony. The period between betrothal and formal marriage could be long for peasants, months or even years, if they needed to save money for a household. During this time, the couple might begin living together, though technically this was sinful if they weren't formally married yet. But communities often looked the other way, recognizing that betrothed couples who'd exchanged vows had committed to each other even if the church ceremony hadn't happened. Sexual relations during this betrothal period were complicated. Officially sinful, yes, but if the couple had exchanged marriage vows, they were married in God's eyes, even without church ceremony. So sex between them was marital sex, technically. If the woman became pregnant during betrothal, the pressure to move forward with the formal wedding increased. But it wasn't the catastrophe it would be for an unbetrothed woman. This flexibility around peasant marriage gave young people agency that nobles lacked. It also created ambiguity that led to disputes. What exactly had been said? Were those marriage vows or just promises to marry someday? If a couple had sex, did that create a marriage, or was it fornication? Church courts spent enormous time and energy sorting through these questions, trying to determine what commitments had been made and what they meant legally. One fascinating aspect of peasant courtship that deserves more attention is the role of community festivals and seasonal celebrations. These weren't just entertainment. They were structured opportunities for young people to meet and interact in ways that daily work life didn't allow. May Day festivities, for example, involved young people going into the woods to gather flowers and greenery to decorate the village. This expedition, happening early in the morning, gave young men and women time together away from direct supervision. The symbolism was explicit. May was about fertility, about nature's abundance, about new life. The maypole itself was an obvious phallic symbol. This wasn't subtle. Church authorities often condemned May Day celebrations as pagan remnants and occasions for sin, which they probably were. Young people spending pre-dawn hours in the woods together inevitably led to flirtation and more. But the celebrations persisted because communities valued them, the joy and release they provided in otherwise grinding lives. Harvest celebrations worked similarly. After the intense labor of bringing in crops, there'd be communal feasts, music, dancing. The physical exhaustion of harvest work, the relief and joy of another year's survival. the awareness of abundance after months of scarcity, all of this created an atmosphere conducive to celebration and, yes, romance. Young people would dance together, partners chosen deliberately, attraction expressed through movement and touch. Couples might slip away from the feast for time alone, finding privacy where they could. These festivals and their associated courting opportunities were so important that you can track them in records of birth dates. 9 months after major festivals, you'd see spikes in births, evidence that the celebrations had involved more than just dancing. Some of these resulting babies were born to married couples, but others, the ones whose births appear in baptismal records with note illegitimate or father unknown, suggest unmarried couples had used festival freedom for sexual encounters. The church tried to regulate festival behavior with limited success. Bishops issued proclamations. Priests preached against licentiousness. Penitentials assigned harsh penances for fornication during festivals. But the festivals continued, and so did the behavior they enabled, because people needed these moments of joy and freedom, these structured opportunities for young people to meet and court. Let's talk more about love tokens and the language of courtship. Because even in a world where marriages were often arranged and privacy was scarce, people found ways to communicate affection and desire. Love tokens could be almost anything small enough to carry and valuable enough to signal genuine investment. Rings were common across all social classes, though the materials varied enormously. A noble might give a gold ring set with gemstones. A craftsman might give a silver ring with an engraved motto. A peasant might carve a wooden ring or fashion one from braided leather. The ring itself mattered less than the symbolism, an unending circle representing eternal commitment. Brooches and clasps served similar purposes, practical items that could be beautiful, worn visibly as a statement of attachment. A woman wearing a man's brooch was declaring her affection, or at least her interest. If she later returned it, that sent an equally clear message. Ribbons and fabric pieces might seem trivial, but carried real meaning. A woman might give her suitor a ribbon in her colours, which he'd wear on his sleeve or attached to his hat, literally wearing his heart on his sleeve. This public display announced the relationship to everyone who saw him. For the literate, letters were perhaps the most precious tokens, tangible proof of someone's thoughts and feelings. Medieval love letters that have survived are remarkably direct, expressing longing and devotion in language that still resonates. The letters between Heloise and Abelard, that famous doomed 12th century romance, showcase the intensity of feeling possible even in constrained circumstances. Her letters to him, even after they've been separated and she's become a nun, burn with suppressed passion and intellectual connection. But most people weren't literate enough to write letters, so they developed other communication methods. Flowers had meanings, though the elaborate Victorian language of flowers hadn't yet developed. Still, giving someone a flower, especially a rare or particularly beautiful one, conveyed attention and care. Herbs and plants had associations: rosemary for remembrance, violet for faithfulness, roses for love, obviously. Music served as another language of courtship. A young man who could sing or play an instrument might serenade his beloved, standing beneath her window, hoping neighbors wouldn't complain about the noise. The tradition of the alba or dawn song comes from this practice. Lovers parted at dawn after a night together, the departing person singing a lament that yes, day is breaking and we must part. But oh, what a sweet night it was. Food could be a courtship gift, especially among peasants. A young man bringing a woman fresh fish from a successful catch, or eggs from his chickens, or fruit from market. This showed he could provide, that he was thinking of her, that he wanted to give her something pleasant. If she accepted the food, she was accepting his attention. If she shared it with him, better still. The language of courtship also involved looks and gestures, a whole vocabulary of nonverbal communication that medieval people would have been much better at reading than we are. A certain way of looking at someone, holding their gaze just a moment too long, a touch that lingered, fingertips brushing when passing something hand to hand, positioning yourself to be near someone, finding excuses to be in their presence. All of this communicated interest more safely than words, which could be overheard and repeated. For women especially, who had to be careful not to seem too forward, these nonverbal signals were crucial. She couldn't directly proposition a man without damaging her reputation, but she could smile at him in a certain way. She could arrange to be somewhere she knew he'd be. She could accept his gifts and attention, signaling her receptiveness. She could create opportunities for conversation, for proximity, for gradual escalation of intimacy. Men had more freedom to be direct, but still had to navigate social expectations. Pursuing a woman too aggressively could offend her family. Being too subtle might mean someone else won her attention. There was a balance to strike between showing definite interest and not seeming desperate or inappropriate. In noble contexts, where direct communication between unmarried men and women was difficult, go-betweens became important. A trusted servant might carry messages, hints, tokens. An older married woman, perhaps a relative, might facilitate carefully chaperoned meetings. These intermediaries had to be discreet and trustworthy, capable of navigating complex social situations without causing scandal. The role of marriage brokers or matchmakers was also significant, especially in Jewish communities where they were an established tradition, but also in Christian society, particularly in cities. A matchmaker knew the eligible young people in a community, knew their family's circumstances, could facilitate introductions between suitable parties. For families without extensive social networks, a matchmaker could be invaluable. Now let's talk more about what happened when things went wrong, because they often did. Not every courtship led to happy marriage. Not every marriage stayed happy. And the medieval world had limited mechanisms for dealing with relationship failure. Broken betrothals happened, though they could be expensive and socially damaging. If one party wanted out, they might claim the other had failed some condition of the betrothal contract. Maybe the promised dowry hadn't materialized. Maybe evidence of previous sexual activity came to light, affecting the bride's value. Maybe one party proved to have serious character flaws that hadn't been apparent during negotiations. Church courts adjudicated disputed betrothals, trying to determine whether a valid contract existed and whether it had been breached. These cases could drag on for months or years, tying up both parties. Meanwhile, social pressure mounted. A broken betrothal damaged reputations, suggested something was wrong with one or both parties. For women, a broken betrothal was particularly damaging. There'd be speculation about why. Had she been too demanding? Was she damaged goods? Had improper behavior occurred? Even if she was blameless, the social stain remained. Her marriage prospects diminished. Within marriage, when things went wrong, options were extremely limited. Divorce didn't exist in Catholic Christianity. Marriage was a sacrament, dissoluble only by death. If your spouse was cruel, unfaithful, neglectful, you were stuck. Annulment was possible but difficult, requiring proof the marriage had never been valid. Grounds included consanguinity if you were too closely related, prior contracts if one party had been betrothed to someone else, coercion if one party had been forced into marriage, or impotence if the marriage couldn't be consummated. These grounds were narrow, and proving them was challenging, especially for women who lacked independent legal standing. You needed access to church courts, which meant money for legal representation. You needed witnesses willing to testify. You needed patience for proceedings that could take years. Some people, usually wealthy men, managed to obtain annulments through dubious means. Suddenly discovering a previously unknown blood relationship, claiming coercion despite having happily lived together for years. These transparent pretexts worked if you had enough money and influence to bribe the right church officials. For ordinary people, annulment was nearly impossible. The alternative was informal separation. A couple might simply stop living together, though legally they remained married and couldn't marry anyone else. Sometimes this was mutual. Sometimes one party fled an unbearable situation. Women who fled abusive marriages might seek sanctuary in convents, not as nuns necessarily, but as lay residents under church protection. Men might simply disappear, abandon wives and families, leaving them in legal limbo. Bigamy happened more often than you might expect, particularly among poor people whose marriages weren't well documented. A man might marry, move to another town, marry again. Unless someone from his first life showed up, he could maintain the deception. This was risky. Bigamy was a serious crime. But in a world without centralized records, it was possible. Violence within marriage was unfortunately common and largely accepted. A husband had legal authority over his wife and could correct her behavior with physical punishment. The line between legitimate correction and excessive violence was blurry and unevenly enforced. Only if a man seriously injured or killed his wife might authorities intervene, and even then, if he claimed she'd been disobedient or unfaithful, he might face minimal consequences. Women being beaten by their husbands had almost no recourse. They could appeal to the church, hoping a priest would intervene, but priests often simply counseled patience and obedience. They could appeal to their own families, but that meant admitting the marriage had failed and families had invested in the match. They might pressure her to endure rather than create scandal by separating. Some women fought back, literally. Court records show cases of wives wounding or killing abusive husbands. These women almost always faced severe punishment, execution, or at minimum harsh penance. Because killing your husband wasn't just murder, it was petty treason, violating the natural hierarchy that placed husbands above wives. Spousal murder by men was also punished, but less severely and less consistently. A man who killed his wife in a fit of rage might claim justifiable anger at her adultery or disobedience. If she'd actually been unfaithful, he might face no punishment at all, killing an adulteress being viewed as defending his honor. This double standard extended to adultery more generally. A husband's infidelity was unfortunate but not catastrophic. A wife's adultery threatened the legitimacy of children and therefore inheritance rights. Medieval law and custom reflected this difference. A woman caught in adultery might be subjected to public shaming, forced to walk through town in only a shift, her hair shorn, while neighbors jeered. A man caught in adultery might just get a stern talking to from his priest. The most extreme cases involved crimes of passion, murders committed in the heat of discovering infidelity. If a man came home and found his wife with another man, killing one or both of them might be treated as understandable, even justified. If a woman killed her husband and his mistress, that was murder, plain and simple. Let's discuss pregnancy and childbirth more, because this was central to medieval women's lives and shaped sexual behavior in profound ways. A woman's worth was largely tied to her ability to produce children, particularly male heirs. But pregnancy was dangerous, potentially deadly, and occurred with relentless frequency in the absence of reliable contraception. Consider the typical noblewoman's reproductive life. She'd marry young, 14 or 15, and begin bearing children immediately. If she was fertile and her husband was too, she might have a baby every 18 months to 2 years throughout her 20s and 30s. That's potentially 10 to 15 pregnancies over 20 years. Each pregnancy carried risk. Each birth could kill her. Infection, hemorrhage, obstructed labor. These were ever-present dangers. Maternal mortality rates in the medieval period are hard to calculate precisely, but estimates suggest somewhere between 1% and 2% of births resulted in the mother's death. That sounds low until you do the math. A woman who has 10 children has a 10 to 20% chance of dying in childbirth eventually, higher than Russian roulette, and those statistics only cover death. Many women suffered severe injuries that didn't kill them, but left them in chronic pain or disabled. Obstetric fistulas from obstructed labor, prolapsed uteruses from too many pregnancies, injuries from rough midwife interventions. All of these made women's later lives miserable. This is why contraception and abortion, despite church prohibition, were practiced. Women were terrified of endless pregnancy. They traded information about herbs and techniques. They took serious risks to avoid conception because the alternative, bearing child after child until one of them killed you, seemed worse. Miscarriage was common. Maybe 20 to 30% of pregnancies ended that way. This was partly because medieval women were often malnourished, working through pregnancy at physically demanding jobs, exposed to diseases and stress. It was also because some of those miscarriages were deliberately induced through herbs or physical stress. The line between natural miscarriage and induced abortion was often unclear, which provided some cover for women trying to end unwanted pregnancies. If questioned, they could claim the miscarriage was spontaneous. Unless there was evidence of herb use or obviously deliberate injury, it was hard to prove otherwise. Infanticide was another grim reality, though prosecuted cases were relatively rare. A poor woman giving birth to a child she couldn't feed might smother it and claim it died naturally. Infant mortality was so high that one more dead baby didn't necessarily raise suspicion. If the baby's body showed evidence of violence, if there were witnesses, prosecution might follow. But most cases probably went undetected. Child abandonment was more common and more socially accepted than infanticide. Leaving a baby at a church or monastery door, hoping it would be taken in and raised. This happened regularly enough that some institutions developed systems for handling foundlings. These children might be raised in orphanages, fostered by families, or sold into servitude. Their chances weren't great, but they were alive. For wealthy women, childbirth happened at home with professional midwives and female relatives in attendance. The birthing chamber would be prepared, hung with cloths to create a dark, warm space. The woman would labor supported by other women, their collective experience guiding her through each stage. Midwives were skilled practitioners, though their knowledge was empirical rather than theoretical. They knew positions that might help labor progress. They knew when to let labor continue and when to intervene. They had tools and techniques for dealing with complications, though many of these were brutal and dangerous. If labor stalled and the baby couldn't be delivered alive, the midwife might attempt to save the mother by dismembering the baby in the womb and extracting it piece by piece. This horrific procedure sometimes worked, though it often resulted in infection that killed the mother days or weeks later. For breech births or other complications, the midwife might try to turn the baby or assist its passage with physical manipulation. Sometimes this worked. Sometimes it made things worse, causing uterine rupture or other injuries. The point is that giving birth in the medieval period was genuinely dangerous, and women knew it. They prepared for birth by making wills, confessing their sins, settling their affairs, because they might not survive. The birthing chamber had a quality of liminal space, threshold between life and death, where women passed through trial that could end either in joy or tragedy. This ever-present danger shaped women's attitudes towards sex and marriage. Sexual activity led to pregnancy. Pregnancy led to childbirth. Childbirth could lead to death. This chain of causation was inescapable, so women's relationship with sexuality was complicated by fear in ways men's generally wasn't. Yet women still had sex, wanted intimacy, desired pleasure. The fear was real, but so was the desire for connection and physical satisfaction. Women navigated this tension in individual ways, some avoiding sex when possible, others accepting the risk, others using whatever contraceptive knowledge they had access to. We should also talk about the medieval understanding of conception and how that affected sexual practices. Medieval medical theory, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman sources, held that successful conception required both male and female seed to combine. The male seed was obvious, semen. The female seed was less clear, but was thought to be produced during sexual pleasure. This meant, according to medieval medical theory, that a woman had to experience orgasm to conceive. This idea had interesting implications. It meant that women's sexual pleasure wasn't just permitted, it was necessary for procreation. Some medieval medical texts encouraged husbands to ensure their wives' satisfaction as a means to conception. Of course, this contradicted church teaching that sexual pleasure was sinful and should be minimized. The tension between medical advice to pursue female pleasure and religious instruction to avoid it created confusion and probably guilt for many married couples trying to follow conflicting guidance. The theory that female orgasm was necessary for conception also affected rape cases. If a woman became pregnant from rape, some argued she must have experienced pleasure, which cast doubt on whether it was really rape. This victim-blaming logic harmed countless women, turning pregnancy from rape into evidence of consent. Medieval people also didn't understand the menstrual cycle's relationship to fertility. They knew that menstruation indicated fertility and its absence suggested pregnancy, but they didn't know about ovulation or the fertile window. This meant their attempts to avoid conception by timing were ineffective, based on wrong understanding of when in the cycle women could conceive. Some medieval sources suggested avoiding sex during menstruation would prevent conception, when actually, sex just after menstruation is quite likely to result in pregnancy. This bad advice probably led to many unplanned pregnancies among couples trying to avoid them. The general confusion about how reproduction worked meant that contraceptive practices were hit or miss. Some methods that medieval people used were actually effective, like herbal contraceptives that modern science has confirmed. Others were useless or counterproductive. People tried everything and kept what seemed to work, creating folk practices that mixed effective techniques with superstition. All of this, the danger of childbirth, the confusion about conception, the church's prohibition of contraception, the limited options for ending unwanted pregnancies, created an atmosphere of anxiety around sex for many medieval women. Sex could bring pleasure and intimacy, but it could also bring pregnancy, and pregnancy could bring death. This was the reality they navigated. Let's conclude by returning to the question of love, because for all the economic and political factors that shaped medieval marriage, for all the church control and social pressure, love still mattered to people. They still fell in love, sometimes gloriously, sometimes tragically, and their love stories shaped medieval culture in lasting ways. The most famous medieval lovers were doomed, their stories ending in death and separation. Tristan and Isolde, drinking a love potion meant for someone else, falling into passion that destroyed them both. Lancelot and Guinevere, their adulterous love bringing down Camelot. Abelard and Heloise, brilliant teacher and student whose affair led to castration, forced religious life, and decades of separation. These stories were popular not despite their tragic endings, but because of them. They embodied the courtly love ideal that true love couldn't be contained by social convention, that it was worth any sacrifice, that death was preferable to living without the beloved. This was powerful stuff, emotionally resonant across centuries. But there were also love stories with happier endings, or at least less tragic ones. Couples who married for political reasons and grew to genuinely love each other. Peasant couples who chose each other and built good lives together. Second marriages entered into by widows and widowers who found companionship and affection after loss. The historical record preserves fragments of these happier stories, though they're less dramatic and therefore less often told. A widower's will that speaks tenderly of his deceased wife. A marriage contract that includes unusual provisions protecting the wife's interests, suggesting a husband who cared about her welfare. Letters between long-married couples that show affection and partnership. These glimpses remind us that medieval people weren't so different from us. They wanted to love and be loved. They wanted partnership and companionship. They wanted sex to be pleasurable, not just procreative. They wanted to choose their own paths when possible. They were, in short, human. The medieval world constrained these desires in ways we struggle to imagine. But the desires persisted, and people found ways to pursue them. The modern world of dating apps and hookup culture would astonish medieval people, but they'd recognize the underlying impulses, the search for connection, the hope for intimacy, the willingness to take risks for pleasure and love. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps reflecting on your own romantic life, past or present or hoped for, remember those medieval people. The noble girl forced to marry a stranger, the peasant boy hoping to catch his beloved's eye at the village dance, the prostitute in Southwark trying to save enough to leave that life, the monk writing secret poetry to someone he couldn't have. They all wanted what you want. They just had to navigate a much more difficult path to get it. If this journey through medieval romance brought you some perspective, some comfort, or simply helped pass the time as you settled toward rest, please like the video and subscribe. Each subscription helps me continue creating these explorations of how people lived, loved, and survived in times and places very different from our own. There are still corners of medieval life we haven't fully explored, aspects of how people found connection and intimacy that deserve attention before we close. Let's talk about the role of religion in shaping not just sexual behavior, but romantic feeling itself. The medieval church didn't just prohibit certain acts, it tried to shape how people thought about love and desire at the most fundamental level. The cult of the Virgin Mary, which became increasingly important throughout the medieval period, provided a model of perfect womanhood that was literally impossible for actual women to achieve. Mary was virgin and mother simultaneously, pure and fertile, submissive, yet exalted. Real women could be virgins or mothers, but not both. They could be pure or sexual, but not both. The standard itself was unreachable, which ensured all women fell short. This impossible ideal affected how men viewed women and how women viewed themselves. A woman was judged against a standard of absolute purity that no human could meet. This created guilt and shame around normal sexual feelings, even within marriage, even in the context of legitimate procreation. For men, the Virgin Mary cult created a Madonna-whore dichotomy that persists to this day. Women were either pure, asexual, mother figures worthy of reverence, or they were sexual and therefore degraded. A man could love his wife as the mother of his children or desire her sexually, but doing both created cognitive dissonance. The veneration of virgin saints, women who died rather than lose their virginity, reinforced the message that female sexual purity was worth more than life itself. Stories of Saint Agnes, Saint Lucy, Saint Catherine, all martyred for refusing marriage or sex, these were held up as ideals. Better to die than to submit to sexual impurity. For young women receiving this messaging, the implications were stark. Your highest value lay in your virginity. Losing it, even through rape, diminished you fundamentally. Preserving it was worth any sacrifice. These ideas created psychological frameworks that made sexual development fraught with anxiety and shame. The Church also promoted an ideal of marriage as spiritual partnership rather than romantic or sexual union. The highest form of marriage was one where spouses lived together but remained celibate, both dedicating themselves to God. Several medieval saints were praised for convincing their spouses to agree to such arrangements. This elevation of celibate marriage above normal marriage sent a clear message about the Church's view of sexuality. Even the permitted form, sex within marriage for procreation, was inferior to complete abstinence. The message was essentially that sex was a necessary evil to be minimized even in the one context where it was allowed. For couples actually living these marriages, this created enormous pressure. Were you spiritual enough to control your desires? Could you rise above the base animal urges and achieve the higher plane of celibate marriage? If not, if you actually enjoyed sex with your spouse, what did that say about your spiritual state? Some couples did attempt celibate marriages, at least for periods. After having enough children, some medieval couples took vows of chastity, agreeing to live as brother and sister for the rest of their lives. This was seen as spiritually admirable, preparing for the afterlife by renouncing earthly pleasures. Whether these vows were actually kept is another question. We have evidence of couples who took such vows and then had more children, suggesting the vows didn't hold. But the very fact that celibate marriage was promoted as an ideal shows how deeply the Church's suspicion of sexuality penetrated medieval culture. The Church's teaching on sexuality also created elaborate systems of confession and penance that shaped how people thought about their desires and actions. The requirement to confess sexual sins meant medieval people had to examine their sexual lives in detail, categorize their acts and thoughts, determine what needed to be confessed. This created a kind of sexual accounting, a mental ledger of sins committed and penance owed. Sex on Sunday, 3 days fasting. Lustful thoughts about a neighbor, 20 prayers. Using contraception, 40 days penance. The quantification of sin turned intimate acts into debts owed to God, payable through suffering and prayer. The confession system also meant that priests knew intimate details about parishioners' sexual lives. This knowledge gave priests power, the power to shame, to punish through penance, to gossip if they were unscrupulous. It created a surveillance system where your most private acts were subject to church oversight. For women especially, confessing sexual sins to male priests could be uncomfortable or worse. Some women reported that priests used the confessional to ask leading questions about sexual acts, not to assign appropriate penance, but to satisfy their own prurient curiosity. Other women found the requirement to detail sexual activities to a priest so embarrassing they avoided confession, risking their salvation rather than endure the humiliation. The church tried to regulate confessor behavior, forbidding priests from asking unnecessarily detailed questions or using confessional knowledge inappropriately. But enforcement was spotty, and abuse happened often enough that it became a recognized problem. Now let's talk about something we've touched on, but deserves more attention: the economic aspects of marriage and how they affected romance and courtship. Marriage in the medieval period was fundamentally an economic transaction, and understanding the economics helps explain many otherwise puzzling aspects of medieval relationships. For noble families, marriage was about consolidating and expanding wealth and power. The dowry system meant that marrying a daughter cost money. You had to provide her with property, goods, or cash that would go to her husband's family. This made daughters expensive, and families with multiple daughters might struggle to marry them all well. The dowry served several purposes. It compensated the groom's family for taking on responsibility for the bride. It provided the bride with some economic security. The dowry property was technically hers, though controlled by her husband. And it demonstrated the bride's family's wealth and status, a larger dowry indicating a more important family. Dowry negotiations could be complex and contentious. How much land? Which specific properties? Cash payments or goods? What happened to the dowry if the bride died young without children? All of this had to be worked out in marriage contracts that might run to many pages. For grooms, there was the dower system, property the husband settled on his wife that would support her if he died first. This protected widows from destitution, giving them independent income and property rights. The dower was typically about a third of the husband's estate, though this varied by region and custom. These economic arrangements meant that marriage was literally too expensive to enter into lightly. For the nobility, every marriage involved significant transfer of property and wealth. This is partly why noble marriages were so carefully controlled by families rather than left to young people's choice. For peasants, the economics were different, but still crucial. A peasant marriage required establishing a new household with enough resources to survive. The couple needed land to farm, a cottage to live in, tools and livestock to work with, household goods to use. Acquiring all this took time and money. This is why peasants often married later than nobles, in their 20s rather than their teens. They had to work and save until they could afford to set up a household. If they couldn't accumulate enough resources, they might not marry at all, remaining unmarried servants or laborers throughout their lives. Some peasants inherited these resources from parents, taking over the family farm when parents retired or died. But younger siblings who wouldn't inherit had to find other ways to establish themselves. A young man might work for years as a farm laborer, saving his wages to eventually rent land and marry. A young woman might work as a domestic servant, saving her wages for her dowry, however small. The difficulty of accumulating resources meant many peasant couples delayed formal marriage even after they'd committed to each other. They might live together informally, pooling resources and working toward the day when they could afford a proper wedding and household. This created the ambiguous situations we discussed earlier. Couples who considered themselves married but hadn't formalized the union. Widows and widowers had more economic resources to bring to remarriage, which made them attractive marriage partners despite being older or having children from previous marriages. A widow with her dower had independent wealth. A widower with an established farm needed a wife to help run it. These practical considerations often mattered more than romance in second marriages, though affection could develop. The economics of marriage also created pressure for couples to have children quickly. Children were economic assets in an agricultural society, future workers who would help on the farm and support their parents in old age. A woman who didn't become pregnant soon after marriage might face suspicion that she was barren, which could threaten the marriage's stability. This economic pressure for fertility made contraception even more complicated. Using contraception meant deliberately limiting your household's future labor force and your own security in old age. For poor families struggling to survive, this was a real trade-off, not just a moral question, but an economic calculation. The economics of prostitution deserve attention too. For women, prostitution often paid better than other available work. A domestic servant might earn room, board, and a tiny wage, working from dawn to dusk at exhausting labor. A textile worker might earn slightly more, but still barely enough to survive. A prostitute could earn in a night what a servant earned in a week. This wage differential meant some women chose prostitution despite its dangers and social stigma because it was economically rational. They could save money faster, perhaps eventually accumulate enough to leave sex work and establish themselves in a trade or marriage. The Magdalene houses that offered to retrain prostitutes recognized this economic reality, though the solution they offered, low-wage textile work, was often insufficient to keep women from returning to prostitution. For men buying sexual services, the economics were also important. A night with a prostitute cost far less than supporting a wife. For young men who couldn't afford marriage, for travelers away from home, for unmarried clergy who weren't supposed to have any sexual outlet, prostitutes provided a relatively affordable option. The Church's tolerance of prostitution, despite condemning fornication generally, was partly economic pragmatism. Prostitution existed because there was demand for it, and that demand had economic roots in the marriage system that made marriage expensive and restricted it to those with sufficient resources. Let's talk about something we haven't covered enough: the intersection of class and sexual possibility. A noble woman and a peasant woman lived in the same general time period, but their sexual lives were utterly different, shaped by their social positions in ways that limited or expanded possibility. A noble woman's sexuality was more strictly controlled because her virginity and fidelity had higher economic and political stakes. She was more closely supervised, had fewer opportunities for unsupervised interaction with men, faced harsher consequences for transgression, but she also had more protection, more legal rights, more ability to appeal to authorities if mistreated. A peasant woman had more freedom of movement, worked alongside men, had more opportunities for casual interaction that might lead to romance or sex. But she had less protection. If a lord or his son wanted her, forced her, she had little recourse. If she became pregnant without a husband to support her, she faced grinding poverty. Her sexuality was less controlled but also less protected. Servant women occupied a particularly vulnerable position. Living in their employer's household, they were under constant supervision, but also constantly accessible. Masters or masters' sons might force sexual attention on servants, and servants had little ability to refuse. If they became pregnant from these encounters, they'd typically be turned out without references, their employment prospects destroyed. The phenomenon of the master seducing or raping female servants was common enough to be a recognized pattern. Moralists condemned it, but enforcement was minimal. A master who got a servant pregnant might quietly provide for the child, or might deny responsibility entirely. The servant bore all the consequences. This class dynamic meant that for low-status women, sexual danger came from above, from men with power over them. A lord's lecherous gaze, a master's wandering hands, a supervisor's demand for sexual favors. These were occupational hazards of being a poor woman in a hierarchical society. For men, class affected sexual possibilities differently. A nobleman could visit prostitutes, have affairs with willing partners, even force unwilling ones with relatively little consequence. The main risk was scandal that might affect his reputation or political position, but sexual transgression alone rarely ruined a noble man. A peasant man had fewer options and more vulnerability. He couldn't afford prostitutes regularly. He risked serious punishment if he was caught with a married woman, especially a woman of higher status. But he might have more opportunity for courtship with women of his own class, more chance of marrying for affection rather than political arrangement. The intersection of gender and class created a hierarchy of sexual vulnerability and possibility. At the top, noble men with maximum freedom and minimum consequences. Below them, noble women with restricted freedom, but some protection. Below them, poor men with moderate freedom and moderate protection. At the bottom, poor women with maximum vulnerability and minimum protection. This hierarchy manifested in countless individual situations. A nobleman forcing himself on a peasant woman faced minimal risk. A peasant man pursuing a noble woman risked execution. A noble woman having an affair with a social inferior risked disgrace. A peasant woman having any sexual relationship outside marriage risked poverty and social ostracism. Understanding this class dimension is crucial to understanding medieval sexuality. The rules weren't applied equally. The consequences weren't distributed fairly. Power shaped who could do what with whom and what happened afterward. Let's discuss regional variations more, because medieval Europe wasn't uniform. Different regions had different customs, laws, and attitudes that shaped sexual cultures in distinct ways. In Scandinavia, pre-Christian traditions persisted longer, creating different patterns around marriage and sexuality. Handfasting, the practice of couples pledging themselves to each other without formal marriage, remained common. Trial marriages, where couples lived together for a year to see if they were compatible before fully committing, existed in some areas. These practices gave young people more agency than the fully Christianized marriage systems of Southern Europe. In the Mediterranean, where Roman law had deeper roots and urban culture was more developed, marriage involved more complex legal frameworks. Written contracts were more common. Notaries and legal professionals played larger roles in marriage negotiations. The emphasis on dowry was stronger, making it harder for poor women to marry. In Ireland and parts of Britain, clan-based social structures created different marriage patterns. Marriages might be arranged not just by immediate family, but by extended kin networks. The concept of what family meant and who had say in marriage decisions was broader than in more nuclear family-focused continental Europe. In regions that had experienced Islamic rule, particularly Spain and Sicily, cultural exchange created hybrid attitudes. Islamic law permitted divorce under certain circumstances, and had different rules about marriage, contracts, and women's property rights. This influenced Christian and Jewish communities living in close proximity, creating more varied marriage practices than existed in purely Christian regions. Jewish communities throughout Europe maintained their own marriage customs based on Talmudic law. Jewish marriage contracts, ketubahs, were elaborate documents detailing the husband's obligations to his wife. Jewish law recognized women's right to sexual satisfaction within marriage, quite different from Christian teaching. Jewish communities also had matchmakers who facilitated marriages, a professional role that didn't exist in Christian culture. These regional and cultural variations meant that a woman in 12th century Seville had different marriage possibilities than a woman in 12th century York, even though both lived in the same general era. The specific rules, customs, and attitudes that shaped their lives varied significantly. We should also talk about the role of warfare and violence in shaping sexual culture. Medieval Europe was violent, war-frequent, peace-fragile. This violence affected relationships and sexuality in multiple ways. Warfare created imbalances in sex ratios as men died in battle. Communities with more women than men faced different dynamics around courtship and marriage. Women might have to accept less favorable marriage terms because competition for husbands was intense. Men might have more choice and power in relationship formation. Warfare also created opportunities for sexual violence. Armies raping their way through conquered territories, soldiers forcing themselves on women in occupied areas. This was routine enough to be barely remarked upon in chronicles. Women's bodies became spoils of war, violations used as weapons to demoralize enemies. The constant threat of violence affected how women moved through the world. Traveling alone was dangerous. Being out after dark was risky. Even working in fields away from village centers could expose women to attacks from roving soldiers or bandits. This limited women's freedom and shaped their daily decisions about where to go and when. For men, military service or the threat of it shaped life possibilities. A young man might be called to war before he could marry, might die before establishing a household. The unpredictability made long-term planning difficult and created pressure to marry young if possible, to produce heirs before war claimed you. The culture of knighthood and martial prowess also shaped romantic ideals. The courtly love tradition celebrated knights performing brave deeds to win their lady's favor. Tournaments, essentially martial sporting events, were explicitly framed as displays to attract female attention. Violence and romance were intertwined in complex ways. Let's talk about something often overlooked: the role of disability and illness in medieval sexual life. Medieval people faced constant health challenges, injuries, chronic conditions, all without modern medicine's interventions. This affected sexuality and relationships in ways worth examining. Physical disabilities might affect marriage prospects. A woman with a limp or a man with a facial disfigurement might be seen as less desirable. But they still had desires, still wanted partnership and intimacy. How did they navigate a marriage market that valued physical appearance? Chronic illness was common. People living with conditions that today would be managed, but then were just endured. How did this affect marital sex? If a woman was frequently ill, if a man had painful conditions that made sex difficult, how did couples adapt? Mental illness, understood very differently in the medieval period, also affected relationships. A person experiencing what we'd now call depression, anxiety, psychosis, how did their community respond? Did they marry? Could they maintain marriages? The records are sparse but suggest that some marriages ended or were strained by one partner's mental health struggles. Sexual dysfunction, impotence in men particularly, had legal implications because consummation was required for a valid marriage. If a man couldn't consummate, the marriage could be annulled. This led to church courts trying to determine whether a man was truly impotent or just unable to perform with his specific wife. The investigations were invasive and humiliating, involving testimony from the couple and sometimes physical examinations. Some men claimed impotence to escape marriages they wanted to end, then magically recovered their abilities with new wives. The church caught on to this scheme and developed tests to verify impotence claims. If a man claimed impotence but was then found with an erection or caught in sexual activity, his annulment claim would be denied and he'd face penance for lying. The medieval understanding of disability and illness as divine punishment for sin also affected relationships. If you or your partner had a chronic condition, was that evidence of God's displeasure? This belief added spiritual anxiety to physical suffering and could strain marriages. Now we should address something important: the voices we don't hear in medieval sources. Most of what we know about medieval sexuality comes from elite male perspectives. Church documents written by celibate male clergy, legal records created by male judges and scribes, literary works composed primarily by men. What about everyone else? Women's voices are present but harder to find. We have some letters from educated, noble women. We have saints' lives that preserve women's perspectives, though filtered through male hagiographers. We have court testimony where women's words were recorded, though whether those words were accurately captured is questionable. What women actually thought about sex, marriage, desire, we can only glimpse indirectly. The advice mothers gave daughters, the knowledge midwives shared, the conversations between women working together, most of this is lost. We can infer some of it from the traces that remain, but there are huge gaps. Poor people's voices are even more scarce. We know about peasants primarily through records created when they intersected with authority, court cases, tax records, manor rolls, their own perspectives, their interior lives, their actual experiences. We can only reconstruct circumstantially. The voices of those whose sexuality didn't fit norms, people who loved the same sex, people who didn't want to marry, people whose gender didn't align with their body. These are almost entirely absent. We know they existed from condemnations and prosecutions, but their own words, their own understandings of themselves are lost. This means any history of medieval sexuality is partial and limited. We can describe structures, laws, customs. We can identify patterns in the records that survive. But the lived experience, the emotional reality, the actual texture of medieval people's intimate lives, much of that remains opaque. When we imagine a medieval peasant girl's first love, or a gay monk's hidden relationship, or a prostitute's feelings about her work, we're extrapolating from limited evidence. We should do so carefully, acknowledging the uncertainty while trying to honor these vanished lives. Let's end by thinking about legacy, about how medieval attitudes towards sexuality shaped later periods and even influence our own time. The medieval period's sexual culture didn't vanish with the Renaissance. It evolved, but many of its patterns persisted. The idea that sex is shameful and should be hidden persisted long after the medieval period. Victorian prudishness was in many ways a continuation of medieval attitudes, though expressed differently. The taboo on discussing sex openly, the emphasis on female sexual purity, the double standards between men and women, all of these have medieval roots. The romantic tradition that emerged from courtly love shaped Western ideas about romance for centuries. The notion that true love is passionate and consuming, that it might conflict with practical considerations like suitability or family approval, that it's worth sacrificing for. These ideas all trace back to medieval courtly love literature. The Catholic Church's teaching on sexuality remained largely unchanged from medieval formulations through Vatican II in the 1960s. The prohibition on contraception, the emphasis on procreative sex within marriage, the condemnation of homosexuality, all of these were medieval positions that the Church maintained into modern times. Even in Protestant Christianity, which rejected some Catholic teachings, attitudes towards sexuality often remained conservative, drawing on the same medieval suspicion of pleasure and desire. The Puritan tradition particularly emphasized sexual restraint and punishment of transgression. In secular culture, the medieval period's influence is visible in everything from wedding traditions to romantic tropes in literature. The white wedding dress symbolizing virginity, the father giving away the bride, the threshold carrying tradition. These all have medieval origins. Romance novels featuring passionate, forbidden love draw on courtly love traditions. Even modern dating advice sometimes echoes medieval ideas about men pursuing and women being pursued. The medieval period's most damaging legacy is probably in gender relations. The double standards that excused male sexual behavior while policing female sexuality, the objectification of women as property to be controlled, the association of female worth with sexual purity. These patterns established in the medieval period shaped Western culture for centuries and still influence us today. Understanding this legacy is part of why studying medieval sexuality matters. We can see where our attitudes come from, how they developed, why certain patterns persist. This historical perspective lets us question assumptions that might otherwise seem natural or inevitable. It also lets us appreciate how much has changed. The freedoms we have now, the ability to choose our own partners, to love who we want, to have sex without religious oversight or automatic pregnancy, to end relationships that don't work. These are historically unprecedented for most people. They're achievements, not givens, and they came through long struggles. Medieval people would be astonished by our world, but they'd probably recognize the underlying drives and feelings. They wanted what we want. They just had to navigate much more restrictive circumstances to pursue it. Their creativity in finding ways to connect despite obstacles, their persistence in loving despite prohibition, their humanity shining through despite all the structures trying to contain it. These are worth remembering. So as you finally drift towards sleep, having spent this long night journeying through medieval romance and sexuality, carry with you both the differences and the similarities. Marvel at how alien their world was, how constrained their possibilities, but also recognize the common humanity, the desires and longings that transcend centuries. Be grateful for the freedoms you have. Honor the struggles that won them. And perhaps, when you next swipe through a dating app, or kiss someone you just met, or choose to be with someone your family doesn't approve of, take a moment to appreciate that you can do these things, that these choices exist for you in ways they didn't for most of human history. There's one more dimension worth exploring in depth, something that ties together many threads we've touched on: the role of festivals, seasons, and the rhythm of the agricultural year in shaping when and how medieval people pursued romance and sexual connection. The medieval year wasn't uniform. Time wasn't measured in weeks of identical days, but in seasons with distinct characters, in religious festivals that punctuated the calendar, in agricultural rhythms that dictated when people were free and when they were desperately busy. This temporal structure shaped romantic and sexual behavior in ways we need to understand. Let's start with spring, with the lengthening days after winter's scarcity and darkness. Spring festivals were explicitly about fertility, renewal, sexuality emerging from winter dormancy. May Day was the most famous, the 1st of May marking the arrival of warm weather and new growth. The celebrations involved young people going into the woods before dawn to gather flowers and greenery, ostensibly to decorate the village, but also, everyone knew, to have time alone together, away from watchful eyes. The symbolism was obvious to the point of blatant. The maypole, that tall pole decorated with ribbons and flowers that people danced around, was an unmistakable phallic symbol. The act of dancing around it, weaving the ribbons, this was a ritual enactment of sexuality. The queen chosen to preside over May Day festivities represented fertile femininity. The whole celebration was soaked in sexual meaning. Church authorities condemned May Day celebrations as pagan holdovers and occasions for sin, and they were right on both counts. The festivities did derive from pre-Christian spring fertility rites, and they absolutely did lead to sexual activity. If you look at birth records, you'll find spikes 9 months after May Day. Those woodland expeditions at dawn weren't just about flower gathering, but communities valued May Day because it provided socially sanctioned time for young people to meet and interact with less supervision than usual. In a world where most time was consumed by work and most interactions were supervised, these festival occasions were precious. They allowed courtship to happen, attraction to be explored, relationships to develop. Other spring and early summer festivals served similar purposes. Midsummer celebrations around the summer solstice involved bonfires, dancing, staying up all night. The long twilight of northern European summers created liminal time when normal rules loosened slightly. Young people might meet at the bonfires, dance together, wander off into the twilight. Harvest time brought different opportunities. After months of intense agricultural labor, the harvest's completion was cause for celebration. Harvest home festivals involved communal feasts, drinking, music, dancing, the relief of another year's survival, the abundance after scarcity, the exhaustion after intense work. All of this created atmosphere conducive to letting loose. Harvest festivals brought together people from different households and even different villages who'd worked together bringing in crops. This mixing created opportunities to meet potential partners you wouldn't encounter in daily life. A young person might meet someone from a neighboring village at harvest feast, begin a courtship that continued through subsequent encounters at market or church. The pattern of births 9 months after harvest festivals suggests these celebrations involved sexual activity. Some of those births were to married couples, the harvest abundance and festive atmosphere leading to marital sex. But others were to unmarried people, festival freedom leading to encounters that resulted in pregnancy. Winter brought different dynamics. The agricultural work slowed. People had more time indoors. The darkness and cold meant more time spent in close quarters, around fires, in shared spaces. This could facilitate intimacy, couples having more time to talk, to be near each other. But it could also strain relationships, the close confinement with no privacy creating tension. Winter religious festivals, particularly Christmas, involved celebrations, but also more church oversight. The Advent season before Christmas was supposed to be penitential, a time of restraint and preparation. The prohibition on sex during the weeks before Christmas was meant to ensure that the holiday was focused on spiritual rather than physical matters. Whether people actually abstained is questionable. The prohibition existed, which suggests people needed to be told not to do it, which suggests they were doing it. The church could mandate restraint, but enforcing it in people's bedrooms was impossible. The liturgical calendar's impact on sexual behavior was enormous. Lent's 40 days of fasting and penance included sexual abstinence. Advent's preparation period, same thing. Major saints' days, numerous throughout the year, were supposed to be observed with restraint. If you actually followed all the prohibited times, you'd be abstaining from sex roughly half the year. This created a rhythm where sexual activity was concentrated in permitted times, leading to patterns in conception and birth. If you chart medieval birth records, you'll see peaks and valleys corresponding to periods 9 months after permitted sexual activity. More births in late fall and winter, fewer in summer, reflecting the concentration of marital sex in late winter and spring. For unmarried people, the festival calendar provided structured opportunities for courtship and sexual encounters. The rest of the year, with work consuming daylight hours and supervision limiting privacy, finding time alone together was extremely difficult. But during festivals, during the relative freedom of celebration, possibilities opened. This meant that courtship and romance had seasonal rhythms. You might meet someone at a spring festival, see them occasionally at market or church through summer, deepen the connection at harvest celebration, and by winter, be negotiating a betrothal for marriage the following spring. The agricultural year's rhythm structured the romantic year. The seasons also affected more pragmatic aspects of relationships. Winter was a bad time to start a new household, the scarcity making it hard to establish yourselves. Spring planting required established labor. You couldn't start a farm while simultaneously courting. Summer was consumed by agricultural work. Autumn, after harvest, was ideal for marriages, giving newlyweds winter to settle in before spring. Planting demanded intense labor. This is why you see clusters of weddings in autumn in medieval records. It wasn't arbitrary. It was the agricultural calendar's logic, marrying when you could afford to celebrate and when the timing made sense for establishing a household. The connection between food security and sexual behavior was direct. In times of famine, marriages decreased and births dropped. People delayed marriage when prospects were uncertain. Couples limited sexual activity when they couldn't afford another child. The threat of hunger shaped reproductive choices in concrete ways. In times of plenty, the opposite occurred. Good harvests led to more marriages, more births, more risk-taking in relationships. Abundance created optimism that made people more willing to start families, to take on the risk and expense of children. This connection between material circumstances and sexual behavior reminds us that medieval romance and sexuality weren't just about feelings and desires. They were embedded in economic reality, shaped by agricultural cycles, influenced by the constant negotiation with scarcity that characterized medieval life. The festival calendar also provided structure for affairs and illicit relationships. If you were having an affair with someone, festivals provided cover for meeting. You'd both be at the celebration anyway, explaining your absence from home. The crowds and activity created opportunities to slip away together, less noticeably than in quiet daily life. For prostitutes, festivals meant business. Crowds of people, alcohol flowing, celebratory atmosphere, all of this increased demand for sexual services. Prostitutes might travel to major festivals, markets, pilgrimages, anywhere crowds gathered, following the economic opportunity. Pilgrimages deserve special mention as occasions that combined religious devotion with opportunities for secular romance and sexuality. Medieval people went on pilgrimage for many reasons, seeking healing, doing penance, fulfilling vows. But pilgrimages also offered adventure, time away from home, exposure to new places and people. The journey itself created opportunities. You might travel in a group that included potential romantic partners, the shared experience, the time together on the road, the breaking down of normal social barriers. All of this could facilitate connections. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales depicts this dynamic, pilgrims from different backgrounds traveling together, telling stories, flirting, the wife of Bath, openly sexual and unashamed. Pilgrimage sites themselves were complex social spaces. Shrines attracted crowds of people from wide geographical areas, creating cosmopolitan environments unlike the local village. Inns and taverns near shrines provided food, drink, and sometimes sexual services. The line between sacred and profane was often blurred. For women, pilgrimage offered rare freedom of movement. A woman on pilgrimage had legitimate reason to travel without male family supervision. She might be in the company of other pilgrims, but these were strangers, not people who'd report her behavior back to her family. This created space for experiences impossible in normal life. Some women use pilgrimage as cover for running away, leaving unbearable marriages or family situations. They'd set out on pilgrimage and simply not return, disappearing into the anonymity of a different town or region. Starting over was difficult but possible, especially for women with skills or education. The temporal structure of medieval life also included the human lifespan's stages, and these shaped sexual and romantic possibilities. Childhood was brief, adulthood beginning at puberty for girls and slightly later for boys. There was no adolescence as we understand it, no extended period between physical maturity and adult responsibilities. This meant young people took on adult roles, including sexual ones, at ages we'd consider children. A 14-year-old bride wasn't considered unusually young. A 16-year-old mother was normal. The expectations and possibilities for these young people were completely different from modern teenagers. Middle age, for those who reached it, brought different relationship dynamics. A woman in her 30s or 40s might be widowed, having lost her husband to war, disease, or accident. She'd have her dower, making her economically independent. She might choose to remarry or might remain single, preferring independence to subordination to a new husband. Widows had more freedom than any other category of medieval women. They weren't under fathers' or husbands' legal authority. They controlled their own property. They could make contracts, run businesses, make decisions. Some widows enjoyed this independence, resisting family pressure to remarry. Other widows remarried quickly, needing the economic security and social position that marriage provided. A wealthy widow was attractive on the marriage market, her property and experience valuable. Widowers also remarried frequently, needing wives to run households and care for children. These remarriages among older people had different dynamics than first marriages among young people. Companionship and economic compatibility mattered more than romantic attraction. The urgency of producing heirs was less, allowing for more choice based on personal preference. Some of these later marriages seem to have been genuinely affectionate, partnerships between mature people who chose each other. Old age, for the very few who reached it, brought its own considerations. Elderly people without children to care for them might end up dependent on community charity or church institutions. This made having children, ensuring someone would support you in old age, even more important than just continuing the family line. The brevity of medieval life meant time, pressure that shaped romantic and sexual behavior. If you expected to die young, you might take risks you wouldn't otherwise. If you knew old age was unlikely, you might prioritize present pleasure over future security. The constant proximity of death influenced how people approached life, including intimate life. Plague years particularly disrupted normal patterns. After the Black Death in the 14th century, with population decimated and social order shattered, sexual behavior changed. Labor shortages meant workers could demand higher wages, giving them more economic power. The trauma of watching half your community die might lead to fatalism, taking pleasure where you could find it because tomorrow was uncertain. Some sources suggest sexual behavior became more libertine in plague years, traditional restrictions loosening in the face of mass death. Other sources suggest the opposite, people turning to religion and restraint, seeking to appease God's wrath. Probably both happened in different communities and individuals. The point is that medieval sexuality and romance existed in time, shaped by calendars both liturgical and agricultural, by seasons and festivals and life stages. Understanding these temporal structures helps us understand when and how medieval people pursued connection, when opportunities arose and when constraints tightened. As we truly reach the end of our exploration now, having wandered through every aspect of medieval dating and romance we could think of, what remains is simply to acknowledge the vast complexity we've only begun to touch. Every paragraph here could be expanded into hours more detail. Every example we've given is one of thousands in the historical record. Medieval people lived complete, complex lives. They loved and lost, desired and were disappointed, found joy and endured suffering. Their world was different from ours in countless ways, but they were human, and human experience has remarkable continuity across time. If this journey has given you perspective, helped you appreciate your own freedom, or simply accompanied you pleasantly towards sleep, that's enough. History isn't just about knowing facts, it's about connecting across time with people who lived, felt, and struggled in circumstances very different from our own. Thank you for spending this time in the medieval world with me. Like this video if you found it valuable. Subscribe if you'd like more explorations like this. Comment with where you are and what time it is, joining our global community of people who find comfort in history's long view. Until next time, sleep well, knowing that the human heart endures across centuries, that love persists despite obstacles, and that you live in a time of unprecedented freedom to follow your heart. Good night, and may your dreams be sweet.